Security Breach is an interesting one. It's the game I perceive as being the most ambitious out of all the ones we've seen so far. It's a game with a noticeably bigger budget to work with. But there's one thing that's missing from all this, and that's Cawthon himself. Coming off the back of their partnership on Help Wanted, Cawthon continued to work with Steelwall Studios on the next Fnaf project. The intention for this one being to make a fully 3D AAA adventure game, which doesn't simply revolve around one sole room, but instead a giant complex that the player can freely explore, while certain animatronics roam around. It's a concept that on paper, I think is absolutely fantastic. There's no doubt that we're breaking away massively from the gameplay formula that's always defined the series, but as a result, this new degree of experimentation now presents us with the possibility of applying other distinct elements of the series in a completely different context. The unique art style we've always seen, for example, this is no longer just applying to pre-baked images. We're finally going to witness these in a genuine 3D space, and we'll be given opportunities to observe and interact with many of these things in a manner that's entirely different from every other game. Now don't get me wrong, despite what I've just said, don't mistake that for me saying Security Breach is the same kind of genre-defining experience as the prior games. In stepping in this new direction, and differing from many of the elements which the series was best known for, we do see quite a few ideas now that you describe as fairly standard in many other horror or adventure games. But again, that's the main thing we need to keep in mind. We will obviously be looking at how all these new additions and big changes have been implemented, but there's a large factor we should always take into account when comparing this game to that of the previous entries. Are certain switch-ups warranted? Do they differ too heavily from the series' identity? And this is a big point to consider when it comes to the fan reaction with this one, as although Security Breach was still given quite a lot of praise from many players, there's also quite a few who had pretty big grievances in regards to the game's structure, the atmosphere and the jump scares that made Security Breach not just appear like a far more uninspired and conventional venture, but also one that's not really that scary. We'll get into all those aspects in due time, but jumping right into the game, we're brought to the main menu screen, one that changes quite a few times depending on where you are in the game, and also one that I find doesn't do a great job at setting up a particularly scary atmosphere. The music we hear in the back I suppose is quite ominous, but when it comes to the visuals, it's a far cry from the mysterious and dark title screens we see before. Every screen we see focuses solely on the environment we'll be exploring, which obviously works well in regards to how each screen correlates to where we are in the game. But in regards to this first one, for example, we quite literally haven't experienced anything in the game yet, and with how bright and colourful the environment appears, it doesn't do a great job in setting a scary tone. This is something else we'll have to keep in mind when progressing, however, as what I just mentioned is an aspect of the game that I feel has to be intentional. When it comes down to how scary the game is, and how it compares to the likes of the previous games, I don't think it's trying whatsoever to exceed or even match any of them. Understand that unlike all the other games in the series that went to certain extremes in regards to the jump scares we witness and the gruesome visuals we see, Security Breach was developed at a point where the Fnaf series now had a very large and strong child audience. Pair that up with it being one of the first games to be released physically in the series, and something many parents naturally gravitate to when it comes to buying their young kids a game, is the age rating that's always present in the bottom left. Look into any of the previous game's Steam pages, there's no real indication as to if these games would be appropriate for their child to play. You make it more blatant that a game's rated for 12 and up though, and you'll have parents who want to actively see this age rating backed up with what's shown in game. Again, might sound irrelevant on the surface, considering many of the previous games were also rated 12 and up, but for anyone who's played Security Breach, you'll know that a lot of care is taken this time round in regards to toning down many of the more extreme elements, and as a result, many players also found the gameplay experience becomes a whole lot less scary, and not particularly resemblant of the core Fnaf values. And let's just say that when it comes to the game's intro, Security Breach really doesn't help itself out in regards to what I was just discussing.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Fazbear Entertainment would like you to put your hands together for the one, the only, Freddy Fazbear.
Let me say from the off, while this doesn't do any favours in establishing a dark, horrific tone, I still think it's one of the best intros in the whole series, because of how this game largely separates itself from essentially all the previous ones. Things like when the game takes place and what the motivations of the animatronics are remain largely irrelevant. These factors are eventually elaborated on, of course, but I bring this up to say I don't think they're particularly essential. For example, despite the very 80s inspired aesthetic we see here with the music and visuals, Security Breach is actually set the furthest in the future. My immediate impression was that this game was appealing to current trends, and at the time of its release in 2021, I think the whole revamped 80s craze was just about reaching its peak. Not a great start, admittedly, for a series that I've always found to be particularly unique. I could almost feel how Cawthon was no longer the main man in charge. I get that behind the scenes, he was likely still the main one to give the green light on everything during development, but it felt like I was watching a product that was heavily focus tested to ensure it was fitting in line with what would appeal to their key demographics. And while I do still kind of feel that way with quite a few things in this game, when looking at everything in a vacuum, I do still find myself appreciating what we see, and still think there's a great deal of charm in how everything's handled. The main purpose of the intro is to showcase the main 4 animatronics, with only 2 of these resembling anything close to ones we've seen before. Those would be Glamrock Freddy and Glamrock Chica, with the other 2 being Roxanne Wolf and Montgomery Gator, with their designs obviously fitting in line with their names. For those who may not have experienced Help Wanted, the jump from Pizzeria Simulator will be ginormous in relation to the animatronics. With Help Wanted, we at least started witnessing the animatronics do things like actively moving around, with the key detail which I think applies to that being where that movement was applied. The fact that we saw the animatronics from games like Fnaf 1, 2 and 3 all moving around showed a step in a different direction. I still obviously preferred the approach Cawthon took with the originals, but it's basically one that he took out of necessity. Whether it was Cawthon or someone else in the Steel Wool team who wanted to pursue full movement is unclear, but either way, Help Wanted was a sign the series was evolving, and that's obviously followed through in Security Breach. We're no longer in a situation where static screens are going to work anymore, which also means we're once again seeing the return of these animatronics who move around in front of our eyes. We'll get into their designs later on, but sticking with their movement, this is something we can point to when it comes to the more futuristic elements we see throughout the game. Even in Help Wanted, the animatronics we saw moving around were still quite clunky. When we saw Bonnie or Chica walking down our corridors, the steps they took were slow and robotic, which equally applied to when they turned their bodies to look into our room. Compare that to how these guys move around. They're walking around, moving their arms, legs and head like a human being. Take their designs out of the equation, and the way in which they're animated shows a massive leap in terms of the technology we're dealing with. There's nothing clunky or slow about any of these guys. And as you're able to see as the cutscene progresses, you've got characters like Glamrock Freddy jumping, dancing and running around. Now, what's the ultimate point in all this? Well, for me, I think the cutscene looks great. It does a great job in showing the cast of characters we're dealing with, the grander environment we've been placed in, while still informing us of how the general setup is still basically the same, only quite a bit bigger. On stage, you're able to see from the sign above that Freddy and the gang are performing in a Mega Pizzaplex, so despite their technological improvements, their main function is still based around entertaining children by performing songs while they eat their food. I think the music we hear getting performed throughout is brilliant too, but I find that's less to do with the song itself and more to do with how it's reinforced as the game goes on. I found it to be genuinely quite catchy, a massive jump from the more ambient tracks we've been used to in the past, but fitting well with everything that's shown on screen. And this isn't the only time we'll be hearing the track, because in many ways, it almost becomes a theme that continually presents itself in different forms while playing, making it stick in my mind even more. As I say, there's not many complaints when observing it in a vacuum, but that's something I've only really started doing upon reflection. The one big negative is the one that I experienced at the time, and that's how it just isn't scary. I get that it's quite blatantly not trying to be at all, but that brings us back to a vital point that I discussed earlier. I mentioned it in the context of the story of the games, and how with every new sequel, while you may want to keep the narrative going while introducing new plot threads, these new elements have to be carried out to a better or equal standard. That same thing applies to everything else realistically, and not just in terms of quality, but also tone. For as much as I enjoy this opening cutscene, there's not much I can point to aside from the animatronics that's retained from the past games. Replace all these animatronics with brand new characters, and there'd be almost nothing I could identify as being uniquely Five Nights at Freddy's. And that's where opinions will become split, and I can see exactly where both sides are coming from. On its own, I'm quite a fan of this opening cutscene, but looking at it in terms of the series at large, it feels pretty out of place. And that's saying a lot, considering we've already gone pretty far in the direction of goofy fun at this point anyways. The animation, the poppy colours, the music, all of this stuff I enjoy, but does it actually fit with what many fans will be looking for? I don't think so. And that did eventually manifest itself in plenty of the responses to this game, with many fans claiming that this more light-hearted and tame direction that's shown from the start is a key reason as to why they didn't enjoy the game. So a very important thing to establish there, because this is being released after several games that all retained a fairly similar gameplay system and general atmosphere, not all players are going to observe this game in that same vacuum which I mentioned. And because we are taking such a big leap when it comes to numerous facets, I can understand why certain fans won't be happy with what they're experiencing from the off. And what I've been trying to get at is the importance of knowing your fan base and handling any substantial changes with a great amount of care. Most players aren't going to be looking at these games in the same way as someone like myself. Because I'm trying to analyse them down to their core mechanics, I am essentially looking at all of their individual merits, and leaving any degree of series continuity mostly to the wayside. It doesn't matter how substantial any of these changes may be in my case. It's about how well they've been implemented, and if their ultimate intention is pulled off well. And that's an important thing to establish as we look at Security Breach, as it very much applies to several key elements of its design. If someone's not happy about a FNAF game not appearing scary, I do understand that, but if it's an element of a FNAF game that's ultimately not even trying to be, that argument almost becomes irrelevant. There's many other game series I've witnessed before that have gone through huge transformations with their sequels, and if FNAF is now stepping in a different direction from all-out horror, that's fine, but it needs to be backed up with something else. Because as we established, if this new direction isn't at least equal to the one we experienced before, this is where you'll find players criticising it, and wondering why they even deferred from the original direction to begin with. So all in all, a good cutscene with a catchy tune. Keep everything I said in mind, however, as all these elements like tone, atmosphere, and the intentionality of everything we witness, all these things are integral to understand when it comes to many parts of the game I like and dislike. Parts I think that work while also fitting in line with what we've seen before, and also ones I still enjoy despite not fitting in. Anyways, by the end of the cutscene, Freddy ends up malfunctioning, entering into a safe mode and having us arrive back in his dressing room, where bizarrely, we're looking from the perspective of Freddy.
Showtime already? I am experiencing a malfunction.
Now, there's even more things here that are quite a bit different to what we've seen prior in the series, but going one at a time, the general setup for the game is laid out in these opening few minutes. We're not actually playing as Freddy, but instead a young boy called Gregory who finds himself in Freddy's stomach. Unlike Circus Baby, however, Freddy's stomach doesn't have any ice cream, and doesn't seem to be anywhere near as dangerous. Jumping out, Gregory explains to Freddy that he's hiding from the security guard Vanessa, who we can see walk outside the dressing room.
That is the security guard. She can help.
No, I don't trust her.
Why not?
I don't know who she is, but she's trying to get me.
And from there, the general plot gets established, with Gregory needing to escape the Pizzaplex, Freddy appearing to help him in his efforts, which all results in several gameplay sequences that eventually culminates in Gregory getting outside. Now, it's not as simple as that obviously, and that goes for how we escape and what we see during our time here, but that's basically our main objective from start to finish. Let's just talk about the elephant, or I guess bear, in the room however, and that's Freddy himself.
Who is looking for you? Your mother?
We've already seen how much they've decided to switch up the animatronics when it comes to their actions and movement, but now we're getting a pretty massive behavioural change alongside that, at least when it comes to Freddy. First off, Freddy not only talks to us, but seems to be one of the friendliest animatronics we've ever met. Upon discovering we're in his stomach, he lets us right out, and when finding out about our situation, he gives us a Faz watch so we can keep in contact, while vowing to assist us in reaching the entrance of the Pizzaplex.
Hello, Gregory. It is me, Freddy. I will escort you to the main entrance.
The talking we hear between the two isn't particularly out of the ordinary, I suppose. Ever since FNAF 1, we've always had some form of dialogue being thrown at us, whether it be Phone Guy, the characters in Sister Location, or the ones that had now started talking to us after their jump scares. It's kind of like the movement I talked about in Help Wanted. It just seems that there's a natural change in direction, where we've gone from the animatronics appearing to not have voices and never talking, to now talking pretty frequently in the last couple games. I'd say the dialogue feels different to how it was pulled off in the other games though, and I mean that more in the sense of how much we hear throughout the game, and the context in which it's presented.
Freddy, help! The rabbit lady's found me!
It's only ever really been Phone Guy, Baby, and the Tape Guy who's spoken to us at any great length. Every other animatronic usually throws out shorter lines of dialogue, all of which typically pertain to our imminent or immediate death. Excluding Ultimate Custom Night, of course. So this is the first time we've ever interacted with an animatronic that appears to have a great deal of warmth towards us. While Freddy's appearance doesn't really look any more inviting or frightening compared to the other animatronics here, his deep, calming voice does a great job in making us feel safe.
Faz cams are often confiscated in Monte Golf, but you will need a party pass to open one of those attractions.
Add that to ours dialogue, always as in figuring out the best way to help us out, and we've got a figure who will genuinely start trusting within a very short amount of time. For those who played the previous games, there's still going to be a great deal of doubt to begin with, thinking that he might be fooling us and leading us into a trap. But that's why it's also important to show things like how he releases us from his stomach, compared to keeping us trapped inside. It seems for the first time we've actually got a teammate, as well as a proper form of guidance. I did find it strange interacting with Freddy at the the very start. I wasn't used to an animatronic being genuinely friendly, and also wasn't used to the character I was controlling having a voice. But most things in regards to the dialogue are just fine. Definitely not impressive, and nowhere near as intriguing as the dialogue we heard in the past, but it's been written more to serve a function. Before, dialogue was incredibly important towards conveying the story. Now, because we got a relatively simple plot, there's a lot more emphasis placed on the emotional side of things. Writing dialogue for Freddy that has him appear more endearing and trustworthy. Dialogue for Gregory that potentially matches up with what the player themselves are thinking. Our first stage of escaping consists of getting out the dressing room, something we can do by entering the nearby vent shafts and jumping down to the large area outside referred to as Rockstar Row.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for visiting, and we hope you enjoyed the show.
And it's both in the vents and Rockstar Row where one huge positive starts presenting itself, and that's the visual design of the game. Security Breach gets off to a fantastic start when it comes to how the game looks, and I'll be honest, there's not many places in which it falters, at least not for me. While you could argue it lacks the unique style of Cawthon's solo efforts, that should ultimately be expected. This game's being created by a whole team of artists, coders, and animators, so in some ways, we are stepping back from some of the more distinctive elements that came from Cawthon's sole vision. That all starts becoming slightly irrelevant, however, when taking a look at everything, because I do think so many of the parts that make up this game look excellent. This is one of the best examples I've played in a while of a game that's bursting with personality in so many elements. Take a look at Freddy's dressing room, for example. You've got so many small details in here which pertain both solely to Freddy's character, while also staying in line with the series' general style. The children's drawings of Freddy on the wall that we've seen in many of the other pizzerias, the small plush versions of Freddy, balloons with his face on, a neon version of Freddy's head on the wall, all of which are presented with a great deal of clarity. While the whole game doesn't appear like this, much of it does, and even though we're more used to there being a larger amount of dirt and grime to these areas, I have no issue with this cleaner, more pristine look we get in Security Breach. In the vents, we get the chance to look into most of the other animatronics dressing rooms, where we can see the other characters' rooms have also been uniquely designed to fit in with their colour scheme. Roxy's appearing more purple, Chica's looking pink, and as we'll eventually see, Monty's also being green. We also get more of an insight as to how the animatronics in this game behave, being quite a different situation than we've ever seen before. It's not a case of shutting these guys down for the night, or leaving them in some kind of free roaming mode. These are the most sentient animatronics we've ever seen, and that includes the ones that are possessed by human souls. Observing Roxy's room, we find her looking into a mirror and talking to herself.
Your hair is beautiful. Your tail is beautiful. Everyone was watching you. Everyone loves you.
And looking into Chica's, we find her going crazy on the guitar. Were they programmed to do this? And if so, why? Especially in the case of Roxy and Monty. You've got an animatronic who appears to be incredibly self-conscious, and another who's going absolutely nuts and tearing up his room. So a pairing of visuals and dialogue in this instance to create a nice deal of intrigue. We could have perhaps assumed Roxy feels slightly insecure purely when being shown her gazing at and moving in front of the mirror, but the dialogue simply confirms it. And all this goes towards giving these animatronics individual and recognisable personalities right from the off. A nice touch, but ultimately irrelevant when they all start coming after you. Jumping into Rockstar Row is where that visual design I mentioned really starts getting shown off to great effect. Lighting is the key thing which stands out for me straight away. We see even more of those colourful neon signs on the walls, featuring music notes, stars, and cupcakes. On top of that, we see many more colourful lights under the statues of the animatronics, and at the base of many different pillars. You've then got the huge amount of references to games of the past, posters, children's drawings, memorable items encased in glass boxes. There's so much here which longtime fans will appreciate seeing. Not to mention, this is also the first time we're seeing many of these items in this brand new 3D context, something which I praise even more, as these models can't just be thought about in terms of how they appear on a 2D plane now. All these things already give the environment an amazing amount of personality, which as I say is translated to many of the other areas in the game. But there's also a superb feeling of authenticity throughout the entire experience that once again impressed me immensely. And I mean that in the sense of not only being an authentic FNAF environment, but also a great iteration of what I suppose would be referred to as a play centre, being broadened out to the size of a mega mall. We'll see more of this when reaching areas like the atrium, but even in Rockstar Row, scale is something we can notice immediately. This room alone feels absolutely massive, both in terms of length and width, and I adore how much space we're given in so many of the areas across the game. Because of all the visual elements I just talked about, none of this space feels wasted either. These environments all feel genuinely expansive, constantly providing eye-catching visuals wherever you look. And Rockstar Row serves as a perfect example of how these things can build the game's personality, no matter if they're highlights or even something more inconsequential. Take the more unique objects first, for example. The cardboard cutouts we see towards the start of the area that feature characters like Ennard, RWQ, and Plushtrap, with a few of these also having their faces removed for children to poke their heads through. You've also got those objects from the past that I talked about in the glass cases. And of course, there's also the giant statues scattered around of the 4 new animatronics. Those are the standout features of Rockstar Row. But amongst this, we see other elements that could be found all throughout the Pizzaplex at large, which still do a great job in fleshing out these environments. The bins we can see that have all been uniquely designed to fit in with the 4 characters. The images of Freddy that have been painted onto the walls. Signs that feature the likes of Helpy from Pizzeria Simulator. TV screens with Freddy's face on once again. Entrances that feature the same checkerboard design we're all too familiar with. All of this goes to say that I think no matter if it's big or small, extravagant or minimal, everything here feels like it's been created with such a fine amount of care. Immersive almost feels like an understatement. The way this place has been designed makes it truly one of a kind. I can't think of another game where I can experience quite what this game offers me. I know some people will point to the likes of Poppy Playtime, but not only is that game very clearly inspired by Fnaf already, but it also has much of that dirt and grime I talked about, which makes it feel a bit too much like a conventional horror experience. Security Breach's environment is very unusual in a horror context, but it's also what I think serves as arguably the game's biggest strength in that department. This is a game that's nowhere near as scary as any of the others, and we'll see that more when progressing forward, but the environments and the atmospheres that are generated from them are one of the only things that truly gave me chills. So excellent stuff to begin with, and as we progress, everything I mentioned in regards to the visual design only ends up improving even further. I thought it was important to delve into it right from the off, however, as it's most definitely one of the parts that impressed me the most. There's certain experiences I've talked about in the past where you find yourself returning to them for reasons outside of the primary goals. Swinging around Manhattan in Spider-Man, driving around San Andreas in GTA 5. Security Breach fits right in that bracket for me, as I very much found myself coming back to this one simply to explore more of the Pizzaplex, and return to areas that particularly stood out. And as we're about to see, due to how the gameplay's been structured, we're eventually given the opportunity to explore the vast majority of this place whenever we please. Outside of simply reaching the exit, our first real objective is to unlock Freddy's door, so we can get him out of his room and unlock the utility tunnels that lead us towards the main entrance. To do this, all we need is a photo pass that can be found in one of the nearby areas, with this essentially being an introduction to the idea of the many collectibles we're able to acquire throughout the game. Once again, I like the way in which these are presented, with many of the items we can find, like shirts, toys, and posters, being held inside these boxes that we need to unwind, and other things like the many notes we can find being contained in these colourful bags. I've never been too big a fan of collectibles in any game if I'm being honest, but the fact that our collection of them in Security Breach is made to feel quite rewarding, with the celebratory music we hear and the explosion of confetti, it was something I eventually found myself actively pursuing, compared to how I typically ignore these things. Not to mention, the items we find inside continue reinforcing the game's unique personality, with there being several different categories like piñatas, balloons, and plushies, but all of them appearing different when it comes to what animatronic they're focused on. It's once again something that longtime fans should enjoy, as although we don't actually see the likes of Bonnie, Night Marion, or Foxy in-game, we get references to them in not just the environment, but now these unique items too. The only thing I would say is a drawback in relation to this is the process of collecting them, and how they impact the experience as it goes on. It's not a huge issue, and isn't related solely to the collectibles, but you should be able to see within a very short amount of time why it can become slightly tedious picking these up. As much like when you interact with most things in the game, this is done by holding down a button and just waiting, compared to simply pressing it once and having us interact with it immediately. Initially, I thought this would eventually result in having certain tense scenarios enhanced, perhaps getting chased by an animatronic and having to lock a door or something, with the time it takes to interact with it making you feel like you might get caught. Nothing like that ever never really occurs though. As I say, it's not a huge issue, but the time it took to interact with things like these collectibles did start becoming noticeable, and I imagine could unfortunately result in other players simply ignoring them and seeing them as nothing but a waste of time. Collecting the photo pass, however, we jump back inside Freddy and make our way into the tunnels. We end up getting a short diversion in between, where Freddy detects some kind of injury on us and takes us to a first aid station, in which two key things are showcased. The first is gameplay related, as to progress forward, we need to enter the first aid station. However, as you can see from the button prompt, we're actually told we're hiding, making us aware that much like we see in the following moments, certain objects around the environment could be hidden in to avoid any nearby threats. The threat in this case is Vanessa, where we get full confirmation that when it comes to the behaviour we've been witnessing in the animatronics, all of their actions are basically completely normal.
Freddy! You're supposed to be on lockdown.
Officer Vanessa, I do not know how I got here.
Well, you totally blew it tonight, you know. Your system crashed and you ruined the show.
If any of the animatronics in the previous games were to have talked directly to someone in the manner that Freddy does here, it wouldn't fit in line at all with how they've been programmed. It seems the ones here though were working off a far more advanced AI system, which allows them to freely communicate with humans, and naturally respond to whatever it is they're saying. And we can obviously see this from how Freddy interacts with Vanessa. She's not taken aback or freaked out that he's found himself in this area and is talking to her. She acts like it's completely normal, and is outright annoyed at Freddy for his malfunction on stage.
Just one more thing to deal with.
I apologize.
Okay.
So far, our only real interaction with an animatronic has been helpful guidance and assistance from Freddy, and now we're hilariously seeing what used to be the main threat of the entire series now apologising to someone who's shouting at him. In games like Sister Location and Pizzeria Simulator, we did start witnessing what many of the animatronics would act like during the daytime, a factor that was entirely unknown during the first few games. But seeing it in this context does make me realise how strange it actually is. Every time we've stumbled into one of these guys in the past, it's always resulted in death. So to not only have Freddy behave friendly towards us, but also others, it goes a long way in making him a far less intimidating character. Although I will say, I think the big side effect towards that is that this same effect unfortunately ends up applying to many of the other animatronics to a certain degree as well. It's not long after this where we do end up discovering one of these less friendly animatronics, with this coming in the form of Chica, who we find eating garbage in a restroom. For some reason, in the span of just a few minutes, the Chica we saw rocking out on her guitar has now turned into something far more dangerous. The true reason as to why is basically up in the air, but the general consensus is that unlike Freddy, who entered a safe mode at the beginning, all the others have had their security programming messed around with whoever's responsible currently being unknown. As for bypassing Chica, in this tiny segment, the general gameplay loop and manner of avoidance is basically established. We're not working with real in-depth mechanics here. In fact, most of what we see is incredibly generic and very simple. As we're told by the instruction card that flashes up on screen, we're able to use nearby objects to distract Chica, allowing us to pass by undetected. And that's literally how we deal with every animatronic in the game, at least up until we get some additional equipment that can help us out. I'm fine with that approach ultimately, while having a large focus on pure avoidance is about as basic as you can get, with everything being revolved around staying out the enemy's line of sight. It's the sheer fact that we're dealing with such a unique threat which keeps things interesting for me. I once again would have to say the external elements do a lot of the heavy lifting in the gameplay department, because as you'll see, if the environment were a tad more generic and the threats were by the numbers, the experience would end up suffering far more in my opinion. The idea of distractions that we see here is fine, but it's one that I found increasingly irrelevant the deeper I got into the game. This first instance is obviously made to be unavoidable, simply so these noisemakers can be showcased to the player, but the biggest pitfall with these mainly relates to their preset nature. Distractions are something that can be highly beneficial in a horror experience like this, not purely from how they can help you progress, but also in how they simultaneously up the tension of a scenario. Chances are that if you're setting off a distraction, you're not going to be that far away from it, leaving a big opportunity for the incoming threat to spot you while heading towards the distraction you've made. I've always preferred these to be a direct part of our arsenal though, kind of like the stones we can throw in the Far Cry games for example, in making these distractions only show up in certain spots, as well as also making them blend in with the environment and the other objects that surround them. I found it hard to even identify many of these noisemakers in Security Breach. Add that to how there's typically a good deal of cover in most areas that feature these animatronics, and you've got a mechanic that despite feeling a appropriate I hardly ever utilised, and didn't particularly feel the need to at any point. As I say, this initial moment is arguably the main instance I remember utilising a distraction. I'm glad they're here, as I get that other players might utilise them far more often than someone like me, but in my case, while I like their inclusion, I think I would have wanted them to create a bit more of an impact on the gameplay. I should have been put in more situations where they felt almost necessary to progress forward, compared to most cases where I simply used the environment to maneuver around threats. Moving past Chica, we get a short chase sequence where all the animatronics end up coming after us, and it's about here where I realised and accepted the fact that this game likely isn't going to be very scary for the endurance of it.
There you are!
Tame is the only word I can really use to describe it. The initial entrance of Monty is rather lackluster, even with it being unexpected. The sounds we hear him producing aren't anywhere near as frightening as the sounds we've heard come from the animatronics in the past, and that essentially goes for all the ones we see. We've gone full circle. We've gone from the bizarre, deafening scream in the first game to ones which fit into the conventional horror category that I talked about at the start. Sounds which are deeper in pitch, with noises that sound more like growls and grunts. And although the latter of those mainly applies to Monty, there's nothing else I'd point out in the others which really stood out as being unique either. On top of all these things, a chase sequence is just about the most standard kind of set piece to include in a horror game, but even then, it lacks any real intensity because of how it's been set up. I suppose the threat of the animatronics catching us could get your heart pumping, but then you've got the almost distant music in the back, clearly trying to bring intensity, but not making any real impact because of things like how low the volume is, and also how generic the track itself sounds. I suppose you can say these are nitpicks at the time, but trust me, these are all things that are vital to get right in these opening moments. You've already made the idea of the animatronics less threatening by pairing us up with one that's incredibly friendly. To not make the others present any great deal of threat or intimidation in their initial appearances only lessens that even more. They're a threat, no doubt, but one that's lacking any large amount of fear. Upon escaping into a nearby office, we unlock access to the Pizzaplex camera system, and from here is basically where the game properly begins. Unlike has been shown off so far, Security Breach is a surprisingly open game, where despite your general progression all leading you towards the same goal, or I guess I should say the same selection of goals, the manner in which we make our way to them can vary depending on how we choose to progress. We'll get more into that in a second, but as we can see after acquiring the camera system, we're able to bring up our Faz watch and tap into the several security cameras in the nearby area. Again, Chica makes a reappearance at this point to essentially showcase how these cameras can be used to our advantage, not being able to get a good visual on her in this box room by ourselves, but getting a pretty clear one when looking at the cameras. Two things here though. One is the reappearance of Chica in the first place. It doesn't really make any sense. We've gone from running away from her, having her locked behind a metal door in which she and the others were trying to bang it down, to now having her be located directly in our path forward. Again, not that big of a deal on the surface, but undeniably immersion breaking, as it just doesn't make any sense. I will say though, this doesn't really apply to the whole experience. These animatronics tend to always be located in particular areas, with us not seeing them anywhere else, and in that regard, that aspect fits right back into another idea I discussed during the first game, where tying certain threats to individual areas results in both elements garnering even more uniqueness and individuality. In relation to the second point I mentioned, however, this links to the camera system we were just seeing, and much like the noisemakers, while I can understand the inclusion, and can appreciate the want to implement a system like this due to its significance in the previous games, I once again don't think it creates any great deal of impact. It's another gameplay mechanic that I just didn't find myself utilising all too often. While the first example gives us a hard time locating Chica in this tiny box room, there's not too many areas in the game that are set up like that. As I discussed in Rockstar Row, there's actually a huge amount of space we're given with the environments, and typically, the biggest issue you find yourself coming up against with the animatronics isn't to do with spotting or locating them, it's more to do with how you go about avoiding them. The cameras are a nice idea in theory, but their usefulness is questionable, and even when looking at how they function, I don't find them anywhere near as effective as the camera systems of the past. I like the additions of how we can move each camera around now, and how we can zoom in and out, but because the environment's been significantly broadened out, I too often found myself switching onto cameras and not even really knowing what I was looking at. I didn't feel the map in the bottom right gave an amazing degree of clarity. I feel like even the simplest outline of where the camera's looking, kind of like the cones in Metal Gear Solid, would have helped these a bit more. But as it stands, I'm once again left scratching my head as to if these were ever supposed to be heavily utilised. They make sure to place many security cameras throughout each area, so the option options always there, but there's too many factors that detract from them in my opinion. Take a look at how I got past Chica in this section, for example. I started off tapping into the cameras, but then simply ended up just following her around the room and observing her behaviour, and that rule started applying to how I dealt with most animatronics. Once I understood how they worked, I found there was no real reason to utilise things like the cameras or distractions, because I know that I can bypass them on my own, and quite easily too. And bear in mind, this is something I figured out during my first playthrough, and relatively early on. I could at least understand if this was something you'd figured out on subsequent playthroughs, but the fact these animatronics on their own became so easily avoidable during a first run is rather underwhelming. Now, there's something else within all that which also ends up getting exposed, and that's the inconsistency and general jankiness that applies to the animatronic's behaviour. Notice how Chica turns around here, looks directly at me, and even sets off the detection meter in the bottom right. All signs would surely point towards me getting spotted. When it comes to that meter, for example, it goes from blue when we're hidden, yellow when they're somewhat aware of our presence, and red when they can fully see us. What does Chica do in this case? Absolutely nothing. The meter itself starts freaking out, switching between all the colours rapidly, and even when Chica comes straight round the corner, once again looking right at us, nothing happens. This isn't by design, and it links into one of the biggest problems this game suffers from, and that's how it can be absurdly buggy at points. And I'm talking about a level of jank where you'll be seeing it quite often. In my case, for example, after experiencing this weird moment with Chica and heading into the main entrance, I came across one of the many staff bots we'll be seeing throughout the game. These staff bots could debatably be thought of as the most prevalent threat we see, as although they're unable to ever kill us themselves, they're directly responsible for alerting the animatronics of our whereabouts. A great addition on the surface, solving a potential problem that may have risen from having these very large spaces with only one or two threats wandering about. We'll get more into them later on, but staying with the bugginess, I didn't know the staff bots worked like this to begin with, and as a result, I ended up getting too close to it, and had Chica alerted of my location.
Who wants candy?
Now what we see here is partially intentional and partially broken. The way in which he just appears directly behind us, that's supposed to happen. It happens every single time one of the animatronics are alerted of your position by the staff bots. Compared to running from a further away location, they're teleported right next to you, which is just weird and very immersion breaking. What should happen from that point is essentially immediate detection and a swift death. But in both cases where this happened to me at this point, to put it simply, it just didn't work very well. The first time, Chica took a while to spot me, before slowly walking towards me and eventually giving me a jump scare. And the second time, despite once again looking directly at me for a prolonged period of time, I somehow was able to duck out the way, move around the nearby object, and have her walking off in the other direction. I'm not going to say this happens in all instances, but let's just say that outside these initial occurrences, I was never all that surprised when one of the animatronics would bug out like this. It's not uncommon to have these kinds of things happen. Pretty unacceptable if we're being honest. A core mechanic of your game always has the potential to break in quite a substantial way, presenting a negative from a gameplay point of view. But then when thinking of the immersive and atmospheric side of things, it's even worse. How am I supposed to be scared of a threat which so often finds itself confused? Once the animatronic does lock onto you properly, I suppose there is some intensity brought from how we need to try our best to run away. But even then, we'll see later on how you're able to very easily find ways around this to make them even less intimidating. Getting back to our mission, however, after searching the nearby area, we eventually acquire a daycare pass, something that we're able to use to enter the superstar daycare that's not far away from the entrance. And upon arriving, we slide down into a ball pit, and are shortly met with another new animatronic. This guy's called Sun, and unlike the other animatronics we've seen so far that resemble something closer to the toy and funtime animatronics, Sun is a really bizarre outlier. You would have noticed that when it comes to how the animatronics we've seen so far are presented in-game, they've gone back to being far more robotic. The movement we've seen from characters like Freddy and Chica is heavy and clunky, not at all like how they move during the intro. Sun does very much fit into that other category though, as we see straight away from how he dives into the ball pit. His movements are as smooth and swift as can be. For what's supposed to be a rather light-hearted animatronic, his white eyes and creepy grin doesn't make for the most welcoming figure. I wouldn't say his design is overtly scary, but there's always been something about his movements which are rather disconcerting. Now that we're seeing one of these animatronics performing movements that are insanely lifelike, not robotic whatsoever, there's an expectation that's getting diverted from. As I say, there's not many factors you can point out about Sun, as well as the surrounding environment, which are actually scary, but the movement in particular is pretty odd. The gameplay section here is rather simplistic, realistic, but definitely stands out when looking at the experience at large, as after we're done, we not only can't return to this area of the daycare again, but also never deal with Sun in the same capacity for the rest of the game. And these are two elements of this section which I think are great. I've already gone into what I like about Sun's design, but when it comes to the play area, it's one that you'd have to say was another rather trendy inclusion. Environments like this were blowing up at the time in relation to the whole backrooms aesthetic, and I myself am a big fan of how things like this look, because I do think there is somewhat of a nostalgic fear that creeps its way into these locations. As a child, most people would have been taken to a place similar to this, and your memories would have likely been filled with many other kids running around and having fun. To now see it return in a context like this, where there's no other humans around, and an animatronic that you know is about to turn on you, that's where things can start getting pretty creepy, and I very much feel that when getting launched into the actual gameplay section. When distracting Sun, we go and collect a security card that we need to progress, but upon doing this, the lights shut off, sending him into a meltdown and turning him into Moon.
No! Why would you do that? Lights on! Lights on! I warned you! I warned you!
From here, we need to restart the 5 generators that are scattered throughout the play area, a task that's easier said than done to be honest, as even if you attempt to follow the many coloured wires on the ground, it's very easy to find yourself getting lost and going back on yourself once you're inside these small areas. I'd honestly say this is one of the very few occasions where I find myself genuinely quite freaked out, and this is all down to the atmosphere of the section. We'll talk about it a bit more later on, but the jump scares are the tamest they've ever been, meaning that any real frights I was experiencing throughout weren't really frights at all. They were more like a creeping sense of dread, and that's conveyed superbly when hunting down the generators. Getting the sudden switch from a very bright room to one where you can hardly see anything without a flashlight is already unnerving. Sun himself was unsettling to begin with, but the switch to Moon now presents us with an even more creepy transformation. His voice and dialogue becomes more gravelly and intimidating. It's not as clear what actually makes this guy tick compared to the other animatronics. When he's not spotted you, he spends quite a bit of his time gliding around the air, but after a while, he'll make his way onto the ground, and in some cases, he even starts crawling inside the play areas, which could potentially result in the two of you colliding, ending up in your ultimate demise. The scenario overall is one that I thought was pretty memorable, even despite the very simple goal. The environment and Moon are obviously the two highlights. The gameplay side of things is all based on simply navigation, and pressing 5 generators in separate locations. There's definitely something ominous about where all this is taking place, however, and the way in which Moon finds himself coming after us. The sudden switch up shouldn't be ignored either. We've spent essentially all of the game so far in sections that are lit brightly, and have gameplay scenarios that are considerably more open. This moment shows us locked into one small area, with a freaky animatronic trying to constantly identify our whereabouts. Impressive on a gameplay front? No, but still damn memorable due to everything else I mentioned. However, as has seemed to be the case with many parts of the game we've discussed so far, there are some other annoyances we can stumble into, both during and after the segments are over. Security Breach works predominantly off a manual saving system, and a pretty strict one at that. At most points in the game, when being brought to a game over screen, you're made to go back to the last place you saved. This manual saving system I mentioned, however, isn't located in our main menu. Instead, we need to find one of these save stations around the Pizzaplex, which are admittedly placed around quite sparingly, and then use it to save our game. Now, towards the back end of the game, I can very much understand why this approach is taken, as there comes a point where a new challenge is thrown into the mix by having all the save stations, bar for one, deactivated. This literally comes right at the end of the game, however, and is brought in more as a challenge for players who want to achieve all the different endings. The fact there's near to no auto-saving or checkpoint system throughout the entire game is quite bizarre to me though. It's reminiscent of the early Resi games, but lacks ideas like the ink ribbons which are key towards why they work. There's no inventory management to deal with here, and no potential consequences when it comes to how many times we save or what areas we save in. It's not like this game isn't capable of using autosaves, as there are points throughout the game where you're always brought back to a certain point outside of a save station. So in saying this, it might simply sound like a bit of a strange addition, but I'll go further and say it's not only one I found to be rather unnecessary, but also considerably annoying. For a game that doesn't use it to any great potential, I only see negatives when it comes to a system like this. As autosaving is just so common in modern day game design, you're definitely going to have players who forget to save their game because they already think it's done for them. Someone could be cruising through the game easily, but just because they forgot to save, save, they could potentially lose a great deal of progress. Okay, it's old-fashioned, but eventually players will just remember to save after a while. Checkpoints are a whole different matter though, as without these, upon hitting a game over screen, you're always having to go back to the last point you saved, or the last incredibly sporadic point the game auto-saves. And the annoyances that can come from this are shown off directly after we deal with Moon. After getting kicked out of the daycare, he alerts the animatronics of our whereabouts, in which another lesson's supposed to be taught in relation to how jumping inside Freddy lets us blend in with the other animatronics. All of this happens incredibly fast, meaning that if you don't jump into Freddy pretty much immediately, the animatronics will end up killing you, and assuming you saved before the Moon segment, you're made to do it all over again. So you see, that's where the issue lies. If you go in this route, don't include moments like this, where failure is highly possible the first time someone's playing. It feels cheap, it feels like the game's artificially drawing itself out. I get that's more than likely not the intention, but that's why checkpoints are so useful. It keeps the experience progressing at a more solid rate, while not punishing players by having them go back and achieve something they've already achieved. Moving past the daycare and up to the atrium, however, this is basically the main meeting point in which all the other areas are connected to.
Hi, please take this map. Take a map.
We've still got a couple sections to complete and a few more security cards to acquire before everything becomes freely accessible at all times, which is also where our progression becomes a bit less linear. But for now, Freddy comes up with the idea to enter another possible exit down in the loading docks area, in which our mission from there consists of basically investigating the area and dealing with some familiar threats in the process. Taking a look at the atrium for a second, however, I'd say it's this area in particular which kind of sums up why I found myself having such a positive experience with Security Breach. And once again, it really hasn't got that much to do with the gameplay. Starting with that gameplay side of things though, it's the atrium which almost works as the game's hub. From here, there's several different attractions, including arcades, restaurants, and unique areas that relate to the individual characters, all of which become accessible once we acquire the corresponding security badges. That's not great from the non-linear perspective I talked about, but it does make the atrium even more memorable, due to how we're always returning to this place throughout our playthrough. Space was a key trait I picked out as feeling particularly excellent, and that's shown off massively in the atrium. Looking in front of the stage, we see a massive floor, containing many rows of tables and photo booths, and surrounding them are the many attractions and restaurants I was talking about. There's so many things here I find to be praiseworthy in a visual sense, but what it all mainly stems back to are the unique characteristics all these things hold. The overall style does feel quite a bit different still when comparing what we saw in the previous games, but that doesn't mean it fails to stand out in itself. You've got the many electronic billboards advertising pizza and a drink called Sodaroni. Look into many of the kiosks on the ground floor, while most of them are closed, you can still see how each one has a colourful individualised sign, highlighting what each one's selling. Whenever I return to this place, it's the size and scale which will always be the standout feature though. I'm not sure if I can pin down why it is exactly, but I've always admired open spaces like these in video games. I suppose it could stem from elements like giving the player freedom. There's many instances in games where you see something interesting from a distance, but can't travel to it. When broadening the scale of the playable area, those places now become accessible, and that applies to most areas we journey to in Security Breach. But it's not just that, there's something in an atmospheric sense I've always appreciated about wide open spaces too. They work well in a horror sense. I've always found there's something oddly isolating and almost claustrophobic once a space becomes larger and larger, and that's what I mean about the general size. Looking forward or up, we see the room we're in as massive, making us feel tiny in comparison. This is something that gets enhanced to brilliant effect when considering we're looking at all these things from a child's perspective. We hardly reach above many of the tables in this place, so everything feels even bigger than normal. It's an almost overwhelming feeling when initially taking everything in, but one that only brings positives. I look around the atrium and see all the different areas that are laid out in front of me, each of them appearing just as enticing as the next. I want to mention again just how much care I feel's gone into so many sections here, all of which I believe was done to make the environment feel as authentic as possible. Everywhere you look, there's colourful neon lights, signs featuring unique fonts, artistic renditions of several animatronics, projections of these animatronics to once again entice restaurant goers to the attractions. For all the space I've talked about, which as you can see from how far we're made to travel at points does remain true, there's always something interesting to look at, and again, that's an idea I've reiterated a few times. While the manner in which we're playing the game isn't all too impressive or unique, I feel the visuals do a lot of the heavy lifting to keep the experience truly engaging. We'll discuss more in a second, but it's on that gameplay front, however, where I feel a huge opportunity essentially goes to waste. It's still unclear currently, as the game has been quite linear up till now, but when we eventually reach the point where things do become a bit more open, and the animatronics start wandering around areas on their own, there ends up seeming like a sacrifice has been made between the gameplay experience and the visual one. Almost like they've created this fantastic environment, but couldn't quite figure out how the animatronics were going to work within it. Getting back to what we're currently dealing with, on our route to the loading docks, we end up stumbling into another new animatronic, this one appearing like the Music Man that we could see in Pizzeria Simulator, but seeming to be much smaller in size. This is another moment that will be pretty freaky the first time you see it, being primarily down to how we're making our way through a really tight vent shaft to begin with, and also how he doesn't appear all that nice either. I have to highlight once again though, that in my first attempt at this, another bug presented itself. Instead of running straight into the next vent, I panicked and got myself stuck in this small circular room, and as you can see, instead of coming after me, like I assume was meant to happen, the Music Man seemed to just start aimlessly wandering around, like I'd broken its pathing. These kinds of bugs continued in the following area, where we need to bypass Chica to reach the next security room. For some reason, when opening the door in this part, Chica's always alerted of your whereabouts, something that doesn't occur anywhere else in the game.
Don't worry, you're safe with me.
That could potentially have just been how this moment was designed, which is already quite annoying, as it's inconsistent with everything else in the game, breaking its own rules. But then, when making my way inside the security room, we see Chica starts clipping into the door, an occurrence that I saw multiple times throughout my several playthroughs. Typically, I would give certain clipping issues a pass, but again, we're now seeing that cracks are starting to form, and specific bugs and glitches we see aren't a one-off. They reoccur at a pretty frequent rate. From here, we operate a pizza bot that's in the kitchen area beneath us, where multiple charming elements can be seen in fairly quick succession. To start with, I once again point to the screens in front of us. The 4 screens behind the center one showing the same splash screen that we've seen a few times now, showing all the different characters behind the animated Pizzaplex logo. And then when it comes to the center screen, we see how Helpy's almost taken on the same role as Vault Boy from the Fallout games, being this ever-present cutesy character that crops up everywhere. And then we've got our objective, that being to make a pizza in a certain time limit. While the game as a whole hasn't resembled anything we've witnessed before in the FNAF games, it's moments like this that particularly stand out in that regard. Even when it came to scenarios like the daycare, that was all still based around avoiding the animatronic, as well as partaking in a gameplay sequence that I'd already experienced in many other games before. While making the pizza, there is a consequence if we don't do it quick enough, but the inherent task is one that has nothing to do with avoidance. We're just making a pizza. Very appropriate when considering how much pizza actually plays a factor in these games. And for as simple as it sounds, I do think it's always essential to create unique set pieces that differ from the general gameplay loop. It keeps the experience engaging, and essentially works to inform the player that if they keep playing, even more entertaining sequences like these will be waiting for them. A final nice detail I appreciate in all this are the voices we're hearing. The first being the return of the hand unit voice, that still remains hilariously abrasive when it comes to how he delivers his lines.
How would you rate your experience so far?
But then you've also got the pizza bot, who comments on the process of you making the pizza.
Let's get some delicious meat.
This same goofy robotic voice being utilised for all the staff bots throughout the game, with it never getting old for me personally, although I could potentially understand someone finding them slightly grating every time they return. From there, Chica ends up getting distracted by the pizza we've made, giving us a chance to enter the loading dock without her noticing. However, as could be expected, we can't get out this way either, resulting in a short patch of gameplay where we need to head back to Freddy, while sneaking past Chica and some of the staff bots. Talking of these, the staff bots are another contentious point which many of those who played Security Breach ended up really disliking, and I can see where those issues stem from ultimately. For a series that should realistically always have the animatronics serving as the primary threat, because of how many of these staff bots are placed around essentially every area in the game, this is what we're avoiding most of the time. The way they work is simple. Every single one is placed in set positions every time you visit a certain location, with these positions never changing throughout the entire game. Their movements are also entirely preset, always moving in the same general pattern, whether it be a route round a room, or even just going back and forth between 2 points. Most of the time, I found these incredibly easy to stay out the way of. Their flashlight, which shines onto the ground, informs the player of the staff bot's detection range. And as we discussed, because there's typically so much space in many of the areas, its relatively minimal range can make them entirely entirely unthreatening in certain areas. Take these set of staff bots in the atrium for example. Why would I ever bother dodging in between all of them when I can make the smallest diversion and bypass them all with ease? Don't get me wrong, there are some areas where the staff bots are far more effective. For example, the kitchen or locker room areas nearby the loading dock. Once you decrease the scale of these areas, it's not just the staff bots that become a bigger issue, but also the animatronics as well. But that's where another big complaint stems from, and that's how many players, and to a certain extent myself, feel there's an over-reliance placed on the staff bots that take away massively from the game's potential. As I mentioned, once the game properly opens up, and we defer from the more linear sequences, you've got certain animatronics that wander around particular areas. Characters like Roxy patrol the atrium, Monty can be found inside his golf course area. The potential here is fantastic, and leaves the door open to an experience that would be quite terrifying for me personally. I discussed previously how the open spaces almost go directly against the gameplay, and that's basically why the staff bots are introduced. If it was purely the animatronics you were avoiding, their sightlines and the routes they patrol were just far too minimal. In areas like the atrium for example, you'd almost never end up getting detected, and as a result of that, the staff bots do essentially become the main threat. These are the foes who more than likely will be responsible for the animatronic chasing after and potentially killing you. And my main issue with this comes from the gameplay and visual department. Even if they crank their sightlines up to a massive degree, I would have far preferred getting spotted by the animatronics on their own. The idea of one of these guys spotting me from far away and then dashing towards our position would be terrifying. Even though you've got a lot of space between the two of you, there's a sinister, sinking feeling that something's now coming after you. Anything like that is obviously out the window. You either get spotted when making your way through whatever section of the room they're patrolling, or get caught by a staff bot and have them teleported directly to you. When laying it out like that, the balance feels all wrong. In a game series known for killer animatronics, why are they not being made the main threat? You can try make an argument they still are, because they're the only ones that can actually kill you, but the gameplay in the series has always been about avoidance and prevention, something which now primarily applies to how we deal with the staff bots. And then you've also got the visual side of things. Unlike all the animatronics, which feature excellent, unique designs, all the staff bots look near identical, with the only real exception being the Night Marion variant we see later in the game. So I'm ultimately conflicted with these guys, but I also think that side of things should have been handled by balancing out the animatronics and making them more difficult, increasing their sight lines, their speed, broadening out their routes. Not to mention as well, although I'll talk in a second about how the jump scares in this game are already heavily diminished, the staff bots only add to that issue. Every time they spot you, they perform a near identical jump scare as the animatronics, getting you far too accustomed to them, and also being quite annoying in my opinion. If I'm getting jump scared, I've made a mistake. Take me to a game over screen. The amount of times we can see these one after the other at certain points is simply too much. So while I understand their purpose, I don't think the staff bots should have been the solution. I believe that to keep more emphasis on the far more visually appealing and creepier threat in the animatronics, they should have found a way to balance them out with the large environments, because that's the only real issue when it comes down to it. If these areas were smaller, there'd be no need for the staff bots, as is eventually shown off in the Ruin DLC. But that's on them to figure out, and I completely understand those who ended up finding these annoying, tedious, repetitive, and most of all, not at all scary. Not long after the loading dock section, we end up getting discovered by the security guard Vanessa.
Out of my way! Gotcha!
Placing us in Lost and Found, she talks to us from the nearby monitors, saying that we'll have to stay here until our parents or the police arrive. Towards the end, however, we see another figure pop up on screen, one that we actually witnessed earlier after completing the daycare segment.
Are you having fun yet?
Both characters are very much linked, which can be identified not only from how their voices sound near identical, but also when looking at their names. This new character is known as Vanny, which obviously sounds like an abbreviated version of Vanessa. Looking at how Vanny's designed, however, there seems to be clear parallels to a certain character we saw in Help Wanted. It appears that much like Glitchtrap, Vanny's wearing a very similar bunny costume, and even when looking to our first encounter with her, the way in which she moves is very similar to the credit sequence where we see Glitchtrap dancing around the restaurant. So in a game that's been rather conventional all the way throughout so far, there is at least a certain amount of intrigue that comes about with that development. From here, there's a good chunk of gameplay that once again all essentially revolves around staying out the way of the staff bots. Along the way, we end up witnessing animatronics like Roxy, who despite looking different to Chica, acts near identically. We stumble upon Freddy during this time, who looks to be in a state of disrepair compared to when we last saw him, and the objective we're given from this point on is the one that basically endures all the way up until 6 AM, where we're given the chance wants to escape the building. Freddy explains how he needs to be taken to parts and service so he can repair himself. And while there's still a couple unique gameplay segments that present themselves while reaching parts and service, most of the game from this point on revolves around getting rid of the other animatronics and acquiring some of their parts to upgrade Freddy. While unique, I would have to say I don't find them all too impressive, unfortunately. The first occurs while in the backstage office area, acquiring a security badge and triggering an alarm that leads the animatronics towards us. From there, all we need to do is press whatever buttons correlate to the doors they start bashing on to give them a shock, while also guiding Freddy towards our position. A situation that could have been tense, providing a to and fro between our safety and moving Freddy forward as fast as we can, but just a bit too easy in my opinion. Difficulty is vital towards situations like this. If I'm not feeling like I'm genuinely at risk of failing, a lot of the engagement sucked out. It's like there's a disconnect created between the gameplay and how the scenario is presented. While the blaring alarm sound, tense music and dialogues indicating we should be frantically running around the room in a mad dash to save ourselves, the experience I was actually engaging with felt tame. From there, we've got one more step until we reach parts and service, requiring us to head back to the atrium and place a performance disc in the sound booth that can be found on the 3rd floor. And although the several escalators we see do eventually serve as a far easier way to climb up to this position, they're blocked off during this section to give the scenario a bit more depth, which I haven't got a problem with. What I do have a problem with is the recurring issue of the save states, and how particularly in segments like this, the annoyance that can stem from bringing us back to the last place we saved when getting a game over is highlighted prominently. All 3 animatronics are scattered around the area, making it arguably one of the hardest sneaking sections in the entire game, as more often than not, you're simply dealing with only one of these guys at a time. Monty sits on top of the kiosk on the ground floor, Roxy wanders around the 2nd floor, and Chica wanders around the 3rd. Assuming you save at the nearest station, you'll find yourself starting off at the stage area every time you get a game over, or at least until you get past Roxy, which also means that whenever you start again, you're having to trek all the way across the ground floor before reaching Roxy, a part of the section that I never found myself getting caught or even spotted by Monty, making it feel even more like a waste of time. Then you've got the positioning of Roxy on the 2nd floor, which I found absurdly difficult to get past in my case, almost unfair. Even with the car distraction we can see to the left-hand side, the space appears way too open with hardly any cover to get behind, meaning that I tried and failed quite a few times until I eventually got past her. That in itself was an issue for me. Roxy never usually patrols in this area. By the time all the animatronics are given set locations in the Pizzaplex, Roxy instead roams about the ground level. And it's once again a situation like this, where I can almost feel how these details haven't been planned out properly. It feels like they've placed Roxy on this 2nd floor with the staff bots, with no real regard as to how frustrating it can be to actually sneak past her when you're working with near to no cover. And then you've got the save issue, which only surmounts to that. I could take restarting a section from scratch if my failure felt warranted, and that it was on me. But too often, especially with Roxy, it just felt like the game was cheating me. From there, I haven't got too many problems though, and aside from the saving issue, I actually enjoy how upon placing the disc into the sound booth, all the animatronics are placed on the ground floor, turning our route back towards the stage into one where we're having to time our movements quite carefully. This is where I see some of that gameplay potential I mentioned getting capitalized on. Even with how broad the ground level is, there's still a high level of threat because of how we eventually get surrounded by the animatronics. We've got one sole goal at the end, and not only do we need to make our way past these guys when heading forward, we also have to ensure the ones we have gotten past don't creep up behind us and catch us off guard. After that, we reach the parts and service area, getting a small diversion in between, where we have to acquire another security badge while dealing with many Weeping Angel style endoskeletons. A sequence that I did find to be tense, while being totally unoriginal. And then when getting back to Freddy, we repair him by engaging with a Simon Says style minigame, and are then let loose to go deal with all the animatronics in pretty much whatever order we please. We've talked a lot about how this game really isn't all that scary, and from much of the footage you've been seeing, I'm sure you can understand where I and many others are coming from in that regard. While I do love how the game looks, and still feel that same nostalgic fear I talked about in the daycare, it's a bit too bright and colourful to convey any real horror most of the time. I like the isolation that's reinforced, with how outside of Freddy, we're exploring this giant complex with no other humans in it, at least not ones that are friendly. There is one key factor that I'm yet to mention, however, that does end up presenting even more creepiness at points, and that's the audio. Now, because this game is so much more expansive compared to most of the other games we've seen, it's not only the visuals that are having to be more intensively worked on, but also the sounds and music we hear. These are things that I imagine most people will take for granted, but we have to realise that we're taking a huge jump in regards to all these things. It's no longer a case of creating a 2D scene with a select amount of models, feels. Because of how massive the Pizzaplex is and how many varying locations are actually accessible, I give a huge amount of praise to Steelwall with how they handle these kinds of elements. As I talked about earlier, it's not purely a case of translating things we're familiar with in the old games to a new format. There's so many things we see here that are brand new and look great. There's no other area in the game that looks quite like Monty's golf course, or the atrium, or Rockstar Row. When you think of all the individual objects, textures, character models and so on, they do a superb job in keeping every environment fresh, looking great while feeling new. It's hard enough following a set style and carrying that out through a whole experience, but I very much admire when a game creates this distinct style while adding to it more and more as we discover new locations. I say all this to set up the fact that when it comes to the audio, we also have to take all these things into account. If we look back to FNAF 1, what sounds did we hear constantly throughout? The sound of our doors, the lights, our cameras, and some ambience generated from the atmosphere and the animatronics. While there are some more sounds than simply the ones I've listed, like the ones generated from opening up our camera system or switching between different cameras, you can understand that while effective, the audio was far more limited. Ultimately, that's because there wasn't any real need to create a wide range of sounds. We're trapped in one room inside a fairly small pizzeria. And again, this is where I look to Security Breach and try not take for granted how many different sound effects have actually been implemented. This isn't unique to Security Breach, obviously. If you looked at any big budget game nowadays, you could argue the amount of sounds and the intricacy of those sounds supersedes this game tenfold. That doesn't mean it's not still impressive though, especially when taking into account where this series started. We can start by thinking about the more blatant sounds we're hearing, ones we would have heard a few times in the past. The background ambient track which frequently plays, the dialogue from the animatronics, the loud jump scares. But there's so many small details which are having to be focused on because of this new format we're working in. The sound of our footsteps, which change depending on how fast we're moving and what surface we're running on. The sounds of the large metal barriers opening. Specific interactions with the environment, like when we hide in a photo booth or kiosk. It all might sound very simple, but it really isn't from a game development point of view. It's not like you're making these metal barriers, putting them in the game, and they just have that sound effect immediately. You're having to source and possibly create brand new sound effects for a significantly wider range of outcomes. If the player's walking on a carpet, you can't use the same kind of sound when walking on concrete. And I bring all of these things up, mainly because of the distinctiveness I've kept drawing back to. There's obviously other AAA games that feature far more in-depth audio processes compared to this, but many games also don't utilize it to its full potential. In the Call of Duty games, for example, you've got tons of different weapons, all of which generate varying sounds when being used, but the sounds themselves are usually so inherently similar that I'm rather nonplussed by it. Same goes for the environments in many of these military-based games. While they may be impeccably detailed, if every single environment appears like some war-torn patch of land, they don't stand out as much. In a game like Security Breach though, I'm made to appreciate these things far more, both from an individual basis and when looking at where the series came from. What we hear while in a place like Rockstar Row is different to what we hear in Roxy Raceway, the Atrium, or the golf course, and noticeably as well. And as I've just talked about, while the audio on the whole features everything you'd expect in regards to footstep sounds and barriers opening, the individual tracks that are played in separate areas, both ambient and musical, but also work in giving many areas a distinctive atmosphere. And talking of that, these ambient tracks are one of the only things in the game that retained a level of creepiness, which I'd previously identified in the series. The main one I pick out being the theme referred to as Welcome, which we oftentimes hear when returning to areas like the Atrium. It's a real ominous piece of music, working primarily off drones once again, but featuring these twisted chimes and seemingly random musical notes that gave me a feeling of dread better than almost everything else in the game. It's the track that stood out by far the most to me. It gave me chills whenever it came back into the fold, and that's also because of how well it works with what we're being shown while listening to it. There's a hollowness and looming nature with how the notes of the track are played, feeling like somewhat of a descent into a darker tone, and that hollowness is very much reflected in the environment, with how there's no other people to see in these huge areas, and also a darkness and fear that remains present in the animatronics that wander about. So I'm happy with the audio on pretty much all fronts. The soundtrack isn't the best I've ever heard, and that too goes for the audio design. Like many parts of the game I've discussed already, there's many things here I'd simply describe as being functional. They work, but don't take me aback like other games have in these same departments. The best thing it does for me is that in spots, the audio can particularly stand out. As I say, with that haunting ambient track, that's one element of the game game that stuck with me, even after I switched it off. And like I also mentioned, in regards to the catchy theme which played at the start of the game, that's something which is reintroduced in many areas to make it stick in our minds even more. For example, every time you enter an elevator, a variation of the song starts playing. And when the music man chases you in the vents, another variation is played once again. It all turns a tune that's catchy to begin with into an overarching theme, which works fantastically. As we know, however, one massive factor that ties directly into the audio are the jump scares, something that at this point defined the Fnaf series, and is arguably the most notable part the vast majority of people identify in its design. So it's quite odd that when going all out on the biggest project the series has seen as of yet, a Fnaf game with a budget far larger than any of the others, and with more resources and developers available than ever before, the jump scares are the worst they've ever been, and to put it simply, they just aren't very scary. The lead up to them can sometimes be quite creepy, as I talked about with the movements that Moon was making in the daycare section, either tiptoeing towards us or rapidly crawling around the play areas. You know how I initially talked about jump scares as almost a culmination to a chilling build-up? Well, now you've got a build-up that can oftentimes be as tame as can be, and a resulting jump scare that's entirely expected, and not anywhere near as extreme. This is where I suppose you could say an issue potentially crops up in terms of how each individual area has been implemented. They all share a consistent tone, but they're not all as creepy as the next. For example, whereas in the atrium you're oftentimes met with that creepy ambient track I just talked about, in Monty's golf course you're bombarded with tons of upbeat music and sound effects. Appropriate in terms of the location, but the opposite of what you want realistically when it comes to building up to a jump scare. On top of that, the surprise element's pretty much entirely gone. When spotted, you can see the animatronic making its way towards you, so even if you're running away and aren't looking at it directly to see how close it is, you know the chance for a jump scare to happen is possible at any point. And then you've got the jump scare itself. I don't mind the sound we hear during it, a bit generic, with how it's primarily based around a high-pitched scream that we can assume is coming from Gregory, and also a distorted bassier noise coming from the animatronic. But when it comes to the visual, there's quite literally nothing I find frightening about the vast majority of these, no matter what animatronic jump scares us. The way they're illuminated is far too bright, which is obviously done to highlight the jump scare and put all our focus on it, but steps away from the darker, more mysterious lighting that gave many jump scares in the past a more sinister edge. And while what they do in these isn't all too different to what we usually see, that being to just freak out and scream in front of us, it reminds me a lot of how I felt about the toy animatronics in Fnaf 2. While I like how all the animatronics have been designed, I don't find them particularly scary. At least in the general gameplay, you've got them ominously calling out to us, and when looking at how characters like Chica move around, there is something unnerving about the loose posture we see her holding, with her head and arms hanging down, as well as having her body frequently twitching. Not to mention that when one of these guys spots us, you do at least have a degree of tension being created successfully. The loud, heavy footsteps we hear them generate, shaking our screen quite viscerally whenever they're close. And unlike the earlier games, we can now see there is a nice amount of horror in not simply being locked down to one sole room. Because the environments are now so open, you've almost got the same effect being carried out in a different way. Whereas before, we oftentimes felt hopeless because we couldn't move anywhere else. Now it's a situation where even if we do run away, there might not be anywhere to go in which we can save ourselves. But again, that's more based in outright tension, not horror. I've experienced similar things in action or shooter games. What makes your heart pound is the idea of being chased by a threat, something you could equally say about being in the midst of a car chase, for example. Add all these things up and you've got a selection of jump scares that all appear incredibly similar, play essentially the exact same sound effect every time, with only minor variations for certain animatronics, and all round are just quite underwhelming. I get you needed some kind of visual and audio based consequence for getting caught, and using jump scares is obviously the most appropriate thing when considering the series we're working with, but I do find them almost pointless most of the time. There were near to no occasions where I was genuinely shocked by a jump scare. Ironically, the most effective ones for me were the ones which were essentially played off as a joke. There's several times throughout the game, for example, where the staff bots will randomly jump scare you and offer you a map, and while these still weren't scary, they were at least surprising, because I had no indication they were coming. In a way, it makes me feel more like these jump scares have been forced into a game that doesn't really support them. We have to bear in mind that outside a few fairly brief periods periods where the atmospheres are creepy, the jump scares are still essentially the main way in which the game's horror is conveyed, which, off the bat, isn't a great look. Your primary form of creating frights is seen as not only inferior to the previous games, but mostly ineffective on its own, so imagine what that does for the horror experience at large. I talked about how I've subsequently returned to this game a few times, simply to marvel at the environment, but that really has almost nothing to do with the horror side of things. I'm purely appreciating the visual design. Is some of that visual design creepy? Yes, but it's not strong enough to build an overall creepy atmosphere. So we're now left in a position where the atmosphere isn't conveying horror, the jump scares are predictable, the character models that are performing them look too friendly once again. So where is the horror realistically stemming from with this game? Well, I don't really have an answer to that. It's one of the biggest complaints thrown at Security Breach. And as I say, although I don't have a massive issue in my case, I can understand why others do. I haven't got a problem with a FNAF game that's not as scary as the others, and doesn't feature jump scares that are as extreme. There's other parts of the game which I find myself enjoying, ones that aren't aiming to be scary at all. While it's still categorized as horror, and having it mostly fail in that regard is a reasonable complaint. When taking things as they are, I'm fine with things getting toned down, so long as it's actively replaced with something else. Whether it be gameplay related, atmosphere related, it doesn't matter. A fundamental part of the series isn't anywhere near as impactful in this game. Therefore, when I go looking for what else is on offer, there needs to be something else to interest the player. And as I've already talked about with my praise towards the atmosphere, the visuals, and the sound design, I think all that's achieved pretty well. As for our final few objectives, I'd say this was easily my favourite part of the game, primarily because of how the openness I've mentioned is now presented. The three main areas we'll be able to make our way to is Fazzablast, Monty Golf, and Roxy Raceway, all of which relate to eliminating each animatronic. The only one of these we can't immediately go after is Roxy, forcing us to either decommission Chica or Monty first, but with us being given a choice in that case. I already like that idea to begin with, and I like the non-linear manner in which all this is carried out. Well, somewhat non-linear. If you look at it on paper, our ultimate progression still seems rather conventional. You go after either Monty or Chica, then have to go after Roxy, and from there, we can either get the standard ending, or start pursuing one of the many others. And while these things can all eventually be accessed by the endgame stages, it's the way it's structured prior to that, which gave me a real feeling of adventure. I'll admit, I did feel quite lost at points, but that's a trait I actually really enjoyed. Nowadays, you get far too many games giving you waypoints and objectives markers that hold your hand to an extreme extent, in my opinion. For me, games should be about giving the player freedom and a sense of control. Giving them such a strong level of guidance starts taking away from that control. Go down this pathway, open this door. I understand this is how linear games are designed, but it's the manner in which it's carried out which is vital, and Security Breach handles this fantastically in my opinion. You're given 3 objectives, all of which relate to decommissioning the animatronics, but from there, you're essentially on your own. There's nothing which outright tells you where you need to go and how to get there. It's up to you to figure out that if you want to find Monty, it's probably best to have a look around Monty's golf course. And that's the other factor of this section which is great. We're given the freedom to journey essentially wherever we want. When we talk about linear games, they usually consist of a process where you're being taken from one section to another. You complete a certain stage and you won't be going back to it until you play the game all over again. And that's where we can start observing the more unique design of Security Breach. The Pizzaplex hasn't been designed in that way. It's not an open world, but it is open. It kind of reminds me of something like the Big Shell from MGS2, or the malls from the first 2 Dead Rising games. There's almost no restrictions being placed on where we can return to. If we want to head back to the utility tunnels at the start, for example, we very much can. And staying with that example, if you do find yourself subsequently coming back to these areas, your exploration is oftentimes rewarded. I enjoy this kind of stuff immensely, and it's yet another reason as to why I found myself coming back to explore the Pizzaplex even after the main game was over. Because so few areas find themselves being locked off, I can actively return to ones that I particularly enjoyed, go and see if I'd missed anything when exploring them the first time round. That's more related to the end game, however, but even while we're in the midst of going after the animatronics, it still works well. While we don't have full access to the areas themselves, we're still able to explore their individual entrances in the atrium. We're actively made to return to areas like Rockstar Row to acquire items that we need to progress. An important point to understand, it's not a case of mere intrigue like I've described, or rather aimless collectible hunts. At points, we come back to areas we visited before to collect essential items for our objectives, and with how many of these environments have been designed so brilliantly, getting players to return to them even 1 or 2 more times will almost definitely result in them appreciating the areas to an even greater extent. Now when it comes to these 3 areas we need to explore, we'll start off with Monty's Golf, which as it sounds is an environment that largely centers around around a tightly designed golf course, with both Monty himself and many staff bots patrolling the area. These are the kinds of locations where the staff bots do perhaps feel like they're a bit overkill. Everything here already feels pretty condensed and claustrophobic, and in my opinion, adding the staff bots into the mix starts turning it into an environment that feels outright cluttered. On top of that, I feel this exposes even more just how unbalanced the animatronics are, and how easy most of them are to bypass throughout the game. The fact that we're dealing with a considerably more enclosed environment compared to somewhere like the Atrium, and still need a huge amount of staff bots to present a sizable threat, I just don't get it. You can see the over-reliance very clearly in these moments. An area that I think should have worked with simply one animatronic coming after you has to be assisted by the bots because of how easy they are to avoid. Aside from that, I like the look of the golf course and the weaving nature in which it's been designed. Although I've talked about the relative ease in which you can avoid Monty, there is at least a degree of peril to be found here when it comes to many of the objects that can cloud our vision, as well as having Monty's colour almost work as camouflage with the mostly green surroundings. On top of that, we can even discover a golf minigame when walking up to one of the arcade machines on the course, featuring gameplay that's highly reminiscent of games like Golf with Your Friends. In terms of our objective, we need to make our way to yet another security room, collecting a higher level of security badge as well as acquiring a new piece of equipment that helps us in countering the animatronics. A good idea in theory, but we'll see in a second how this ultimately makes their overall threat even more minimal than I already perceived. From there, if you want to take down Monty, you're made to go to a place known as Size on the 3rd floor. But once again, in my playthrough, the open nature of the game design was shown off perfectly. Because of how we're not handheld to each individual objective, I went off the beaten path and subsequently ended up in an arcade that's adjacent to the El Chips restaurant on the top floor. I had no real clue what I was doing, but I was having a lot of fun. This is what I mean about giving the player an experience that conveys a real sense of adventure, while there is a much bigger chance of them hitting a brick wall with this approach, leaving them in a position where they don't know what to do with no real guidance to assist them. I'll take that any day over a set route that's laid out blatantly for the player. In this area, you end up finding another higher tier security badge, and get a resulting gameplay sequence that has us fending off against two animatronics, in a manner very similar to that of FNAF 1, with Chica and Monty both coming in from two entrances to the right and left, where we need to close each door when they launch an attack. Don't get me wrong, to reach the end of the game, you have to eventually come to this place, and engage with everything I've just described, but it's the context in which individual players will reach these moments that can create the biggest difference. The fact that I was allowed to go on my own path and progress on my own terms felt great. It made the gameplay segments I experienced and the items I acquired feel even more rewarding, because it felt like I had discovered them, and wasn't simply guided towards them by the game. Now, with all that being said, what occurred in my playthrough directly after this segment is arguably the main rebuttal towards the type of structure I've spent a large amount of time praising, and that's how upon leaving the area and heading back to the Atrium, I found myself lost once again. But this time, I did hit a brick wall, and had no real idea on how to progress forward. This came about from an error on my part. In Monty's golf course, I picked up the Faz camera, but had missed the Size pass, which is the only thing that allows us inside the Size attraction. Getting inside here was now essential, so there was no way of getting inside Fazablast anymore to go after Chica, and I couldn't go after Roxy because to reach her I need the upgrades that are provided from defeating Monty. Don't get me wrong, this was all on me, and that's kind of the point I'm getting at. I should have been more observant when inside the golf course security room, and because I wasn't, I'm now suffering the consequences. I see that as something which will vary from person to person, and I'd argue I'm perhaps in the minority on how I felt in regards to this. Maybe you could argue at this point a tip or reminder system would have been helpful, and yeah, I guess that would have worked. But from my perspective, the reason I still enjoyed my time despite having a substantial period where I was basically wandering around aimlessly is because I was getting even more familiar with many of the environments. I was discovering even more secrets when returning to previous areas, and utilising things like my new security badges to access areas I hadn't been to before. If the experience is more direct and you're funneled from A to B to C, there's no room for that level of exploration. You do have to consider the flip side though, and that's how the lack of guidance, as well as how normalised handholding has now become in so many games now, will definitely result in players who aren't as thrilled to do what I did, and simply wander around till I found something. Maybe it is because I was looking at the game with a more analytical point of view. I loved seeing certain areas again, because of how I was able to appreciate even more details that I may have missed the first time round. Other players won't feel that way at all, simply wanting to reach the next objective as soon as possible. And that's a mindset I can't criticise whatsoever. I do very much understand if someone's far more frustrated in the same situation that I was put in. But again, that's the sacrifice that has to be taken when approaching this type of game design, and it's one that, despite appearing confusing and slightly annoying in the moment, could result in you being a bit more appreciative once the game's over. With all that being said, once you acquire the Size pass from Monty Golf, as well as the control key that can be found back in the daycare, we can finally make make our way inside Mazer-Size. And talking of things I didn't appreciate too much, the puzzle we get here, while appearing fairly standard in theory, was one that I found way more tedious than it should have been. As you can see from the room laid out in front of us, the whole puzzle was based around creating a path forward so we can eventually reach the vent shaft that's on the far wall. To do this, we need to rearrange the maze by utilising the control panel in the nearby room, and that's where things turn majorly sour. The Mazer-Size segment is my least favourite moment in the game by far, as what you essentially get is a puzzle that I've experienced many times before, being carried out in the most unnecessarily complicated manner possible. First off, you've got a room featuring tons of different walls that we need to move, and to do this, it's not a case of simply rotating them individually. Instead, we have to press these 2 rows of buttons, ranging from 1 to 5, as well as flipping the switch beside them to move them horizontally or vertically. Even when laying it out like that, I'm still somewhat perplexed at how the mechanics actually work. When I say horizontally and vertically, I'm talking about a flat plane. Forwards, backwards, left and right. That's where the confusion immediately began for me. Surely if you push a section forward enough times, it won't be able to go forward anymore. But it doesn't work like that. No matter what button you push, there's always a resulting outcome, one that we can just barely identify when looking at the small screen beside the switch. Then you've got the buttons. 1 to 5 in terms of what? What position does button 2 move compared to 3? None of this is laid out clearly whatsoever. Take a look at this diagram I found online. As they know, each piece is moved by 1 space based on what button is pressed. Looking at the panel we're working with, we can see that on the left hand side, the 2 rows indicate which direction one of these sections will get pushed. The top being left and up, the bottom being right and down. And from there, it's all about moving these pieces in a certain order so the pathway to the vent is revealed. As I said, in theory, that shouldn't be so bad. There's many other puzzles I've played in other games that are pretty similar to this. It's all about rearranging certain parts to get a final result. However, that's where the presentation of the moment creates a huge problem. Listing these sections as 1 to 5 is already a massive issue for me. I'd understand if you entered the maze room and were able to see which of these numbers correlate to each section, but that's not the case whatsoever, leaving you in a situation where you need to essentially experiment for a while and see the effect each button creates. And the only way to really see this is the image on the right hand side. That image in itself is a massive issue. Because of how we're never able to actually see these sections due to how we're pressing the buttons, it's even more difficult to figure out what's going on with each button push. Add that to how there's 10 possible movements we can make overall when pressing any of these buttons horizontally or vertically, and you've got a pretty massive number of outcomes you can end up with, many of which will barely be noticeable when looking at the screen. That leads the process to be even more convoluted and drawn out. You're having to actively remember or even take a picture of the changing positions so you can have a better chance of not going in a direction that's incorrect, all the while having to solve the puzzle itself. And as you can see in many guides online, even the most direct solution still contains quite a few button pushes and flip switches. I'll be honest, I found the difficulty increase damn near impossible. My initial intrigue in this section quickly resulted in pure frustration when realising the only real challenge is stemming from confusion. The best puzzle games are ones which lay the fundamentals out clearly to the player. A game like Portal never has you questioning how the portal system works, because it's conveyed to the player in such a concise way, and therefore the puzzles aren't based around figuring out which button does what and how you get certain mechanics to work properly. It's purely about how you manage the placement of your portals, your movements, and your timing. None of these traits are seen in a sequence like this. The only reason I and many others struggle with it is just because there's so much confusion in regards to what buttons move which sections, how many outcomes can result from all these button pushes, and the fact that we aren't even given a clear chance to observe the changes we're making. Following on from Mazer-Size, we find ourselves in what basically boils down to a boss fight against Monty. One that doesn't have us taking him on directly, of course, but instead requires us to fill up a bucket by shooting many of the balls from the cannons scattered around the area. Much like all of the gameplay sections throughout the game, I find it mechanically simplistic. I like how we're given a brief moment to test out the cannons before the sequence begins, and I also enjoy the brief cutscene that plays before the encounter, showing off a certain amount of menace and charm from Monty.
Rock and roll!
But aside from that, you are literally just shooting balls into a bucket, with the only real challenge coming from how Monty continually pursues you, as well as the different ranges you're having to fire from, with how all the cannons are placed in separate areas of the arena. Shoot enough balls in, and you've won. Something you'll see prominently highlighted in not only Monty, but also the other animatronics at this point, is how dirty many of them have now become. As I've discussed, Security Breach continues on a trend that I felt was heavily present in Fnaf 2, where despite me liking their colourful, more futuristic designs, I just don't find them all that scary. scary. Security Breach gets more of a pass in this regard, I suppose. One of these, that being Freddy, is supposed to be friendly this time, and considering Security Breach is set furthest in the future, it admittedly wouldn't make any sense for these to feature the same uncanny, worn-down designs we saw from the animatronics in a game like Fnaf 1. In terms of the world that's presented and the environments we witness, they fit right in, but as a result of that, I find there's no real fear factor with their initial designs. They're simply too unrealistic and toy-like. As the game goes on, that gradually changes, with how each of them get dirtier and dirtier with each progressing hour. A nice detail in itself, even if it is rather unnecessary, with all the animatronics being let loose and assumedly wandering in places they aren't supposed to be. You could understand why they end up getting covered in so much muck. That's not to say they up the fear factor to any massive extent, but there is at least something that you could say brings more of an edge to their designs. With that being said, what we see after the Monty boss fight is yet another transformation, one that remains permanent and applies to all the other animatronics when dealing with them. We get another cutscene upon completing the boss fight, showing Monty being overwhelmed by the bucket, falling onto the stage below and being left in an absolute wreck as a result. Not only is his face and body smashed up, but he also finds himself losing his bottom half entirely. Taking an even closer look at his model though, we do essentially see a complete redesign. His arms have been torn off, revealing the sharp claws of the endoskeleton. The facial damage leaves his jaw loosely hanging down, and one of his eyes partially closed. And luckily, this effort doesn't go to waste, because as we eventually discover when making our way to some of the other areas, characters like Monty do very much end up returning in these more twisted forms, ultimately providing the same threat as before, but actually delivering a sense of fear in my opinion from the state of disrepair he finds himself in. And as you can naturally assume, this is how it goes for all three animatronics once you've dealt with them, all of which have equally broken designs, with Glamrock Chica having multiple cracks in her suit, with the highlight being the gaping hole in her mouth, resulting in a figure that I perceive as one of the creepiest in the game. And then you've got Roxy, who also ends up as an absolute mess, losing most of her torso and most prominently her eyes. Another case of a previously tame design being turned into one that actually conveys feelings of fear and intimidation. After our fight with Monty, we're now back on a more linear pathway, having to make our way to Roxy Raceway to not only take down Roxy, but to also access a brand new area that helps us in doing it. It may sound like I'm being rather slapdash with my approach to these gameplay sections, but that's really because outside of the brand new environments we're witnessing, all of which you can see for yourselves and all of which I've already talked about at great length, the gameplay is just so similar. The exploration of a new area is what keeps things fresh. What we actually do has been the same for almost every part of the game so far. Arrive in a new place, scout around the area while trying to find collectibles and our route forward, and then going from there. Our initial venture into Roxy Raceway is no different, having a search in areas mostly outside of the racetrack in the middle for a dance pass and a robot's head that we'll need to attach onto a staff bot to eventually take Roxy down. Again, I still enjoy all this stuff, but it's just nothing new particularly. The manner in which we approach every encounter is near identical, because of how the animatronics all act relatively the same, and the only alternate threat are the staff bots, which literally act the same. Still, it has to be said in sections like this how much freedom is given towards the player in terms of their exploration once again. Not in terms of the size of the areas, despite that also applying, but the lack of hand-holding I've mentioned a few times already. The dance pass that's essential to progressing is found in one of several garages, being contained in the same gift boxes like usual, and on top of that, when going after the robot's head, this is tucked away in a pretty enclosed part of the raceway. Could this lead to players missing these things and subsequently getting lost? Most definitely, but we've now reached a point in the game where I hope an outcome like that will be more avoidable when considering how you've had to handle all the previous segments to get here. That's where you could argue a positive stems from a trait that has mostly negative connotations. Describing an experience as fairly similar throughout isn't a great thing to hear. Even with FPS games that are all based around shooting your enemy, you tend to find many developers throw multiple variations into the mix to keep things fresh. If we want to use Call of Duty as an example again, you always tend to find there's a vehicle section thrown in somewhere that takes us away from the boots on the ground combat. But even when staying in that category, my mind always gravitates towards missions like All Gillied Up, that gets the all-out extreme combat we usually partake in and flips it on its head. Or, if you want to look to missions that are more unique on a mechanical basis, you've got the likes of Captured in Advanced Warfare, where you only have one arm and subsequently have to pick up all the enemy's weapons because of how you can't reload. Or how about Cliffhanger, a mission that has the opening parts entirely revolved around scaling up an icy mountain. But getting back to the point, in the context of Security Breach, this overall similarity between gameplay sections isn't too much of a bad thing in my opinion. For what it may lack in the gameplay department is made up for in boatloads when it comes to the world and the personality we garner from it. That's what keeps things fresh for me. So when subsequently observing the gameplay and how it's carried out in each of the new locations we visit, it, you can then make an argument that the binary nature of the game design is what makes it work. The reason I think Call of Duty finds itself going for the more unique gameplay scenarios is not only because of how long the series has gone on for, but also because of how, without them, you've got literally the same gameplay on repeat. You've got plenty of puzzles and unique gameplay scenarios in Security Breach already, but even though most of the experience consists of rolling up to areas, searching around, and avoiding the animatronics, I feel you learn certain lessons that you can subsequently utilize on following areas that adhere to the same type of design. Whereas at the start of the game I may have missed the dance pass, for example, because I was made to realise how vital exploration is, due to how the game doesn't typically indicate where all these quest items are, as well as also suffering a moment where I found myself completely lost, solely because of my own negligence. I'm approaching subsequent areas in a different and more thorough manner than before, which inevitably results in me naturally appreciating more aspects of the game even deeper. As for the diversion we have to make before dealing with Roxy, this takes us to another arcade, with it being one of, if not the largest one we experience in the game. We need to repair the head that we acquired from Roxy Raceway, so that it can actually drive around the racecourse and hopefully collide with Roxy in the process. There's a very good reason as to why this arcade in particular is so expansive, however, and it's one that's revealed upon heading to the upper areas and coming within touching distance of repairing the head. Just as we're about to interact with a repair machine, the power goes out, meaning we have to go all the way back down and flip a switch on the ground floor. On our way there, you'll likely notice a giant version of Music Man resting on the stage near the power switch, and upon turning it back on, he seems to have disappeared. Much like the daycare gameplay segment, from here we need to make our way around the arcade while locating and flipping 3 more switches. This is another section I really enjoyed. Firstly, we once again witness the benefit of simply giving the player their sole objective, as opposed to guiding them towards the goal. For me, these switches were not all that easy to find. Aside from the one in the restrooms, which is more easily discoverable due to there being a pretty out of place staff door inside, the 2 others are tucked away in small crevices and behind arcade machines, making it so that even players with a fairly keen eye when observing their environment could run right past them. So that's already good. It prolongs the gameplay segment, thus making it more memorable when feeling more like an actual event. But on top of that, you've also got the animatronics that turn up here, which could potentially draw the section out even longer, depending on how many times you're caught by them. But at the same time, they'll likely also contribute to you missing many of these switches. Around the arcade, you've got Chica, the return of Monty, and DJ Music Man, all of which we need to deal with simultaneously. Chica behaves about as you'd expect, but Monty, much like we eventually see with all the wrecked animatronics, behaves and obviously appears quite a bit different. There's 2 main differences in his case, those being the removal of his legs, making it so that he's only able to crawl on the floor, albeit at a very rapid rate, but also the removal of his sunglasses. The first is what I clarify as a brand new advantage for Monty and a threat towards us. Having him be lower on the ground while still moving fast could possibly result in you initially overlooking him and not giving yourself enough time to run away. The other, however, is a definite advantage for us, as with the removal of his glasses, we're now able to use our Faz camera to stun him whenever he spots us. I enjoy all these minor switch-ups, as although our main way of staying alive still revolves around just running away, the new advantages that we're given now allows us to turn the tables a bit, using our equipment and wits to achieve a sense of dominance over these guys for the first time, which, as I say, also applies to the other animatronics when they inevitably become wrecked. That means the only other new threat is DJ Music Man, someone who presents themselves in a fantastic way upon flipping the nearest switch in the restroom. Much like most things in the game, I wouldn't describe the appearance of DJ Music Man to be dreadfully frightening, but from the sheer size of it, he is damn intimidating. The way he functions did confuse me, to be honest, and I assume that's mostly related to how he's balanced out with the environment we find ourselves in. For one of the largest animatronics in the game, it's pretty hilarious how he's been stuck into an area that's actually a lot more cramped. This meant that outside the first encounter with him in the restrooms, he does remain fairly absent throughout the rest of the section, which I do find a bit of a shame. Much like Sun during the daycare segment, I feel like when you're introducing animatronics outside the main 3 that essentially work as one-offs, they should be the highlight. And while in terms of his appearance, you would say that's the case, I think he should have been a sizable threat as well. The only times I felt at risk of getting jump scared were in the restrooms and the final moment of this section where we have to make a mad dash away from him. As he is though, I still like DJ Music Man. As I say, his gigantic size paired up with the cramped environment leads to a pretty overwhelming feeling that starts to creep in during this section, and not to mention, there is actually a good deal of creepiness I think's garnered from how he moves around the arcade, crawling onto the walls and ceilings while disappearing down many of the large openings. Overall, this is another gameplay segment that I think is constructed pretty well. Taking the whole save state issue out of the equation, which does very much present itself once again with how you need to come back down and flip the initial switch every single time, it's one where you're made to feel incredibly overwhelmed while having having a set of targets that aren't particularly in plain sight. The dynamic that's created with that is great. You're simultaneously having to be analytical in regards to the environment so you can spot the switches, while not being given the chance at points because of the several animatronics that come after us. That's where it should also be said the music we hear continually play in the back plays a huge role in amplifying these feelings, getting a tense, rocky techno track that not only fits the scenario in the first place, but can also get so loud at points to where it could even give you trouble when trying to concentrate and identify the sounds of nearby threats. As I've alluded to as well, the way the segment ends off is absolutely superb, having this music elevate even further while DJ Music Man presents himself out the darkness before chasing us down this massive corridor. The way in which he appears during this final sprint and the destruction he creates behind us being the best showcase of the creepiness and genuine fear a figure like him can present. I found myself totally engrossed during the segment as a whole, but especially during that final moment we're made to experience some proper heart-pounding stuff. From there, we can finally repair the robot head, and upon making our way back to Roxy Raceway, we place it onto the staff bot and get a short cutscene showing us taking out Roxy. A bit of a shame we don't get another boss fight akin to what we saw with Monty, but obviously, the Music Man section is what we had to endure in this case to take her out. Unlike Monty, however, who only showed up in his broken state during that previous segment, we get a short section immediately after collecting Roxy's eyes, which shows off how she now functions. And both these things are about as conventional as you can imagine. With no eyes, Roxy now resorts to purely sound to locate us, entering this manic phase whenever she hears something, whether it be our footsteps or a distraction we set off. And that's highlighted in how we get out of the place we found ourselves in, presenting a gameplay scenario that I've seen be pulled off identically in games like Gears of War, where you have to lure Roxy in by generating sound, before stepping out the way so that she breaks the wooden doors that block her exit. Things can get pretty tense in the final area we make our way into, with our surroundings being more confined because of the flames that burst out the floor, but it's still not enough for me to be impressed particularly, with that going for the gameplay itself as well as Roxy's new functionality. While not being a huge leap, I at least enjoyed the new positives and negatives that were presented with Monty. I understand what's attempting to be achieved with Roxy, but once again, because of aspects like how wide many of the areas are, we've already seen how the animatronic sightlines are rather limited anyway. After this unique gameplay segment, Roxy finds herself locked down to the atrium once again, meaning that essentially all of our encounters with her will take place here. And in my opinion, there's almost no difference in how we tackle her because of this. The area's wide enough to where she can't see or hear us most of the time, and even if she does, we're able to run away, or easily pull off that corner exploit I talked about. It's another case of wasted potential. You've got an opportunity for there to be some standout moments with the animatronics outside of the set piece based moments, and alongside that, you've also got animatronics that offer something a bit different to how they were previously. Neither of those are capitalized on at all in my opinion. Someone like Roxy's tackled in essentially the exact same way, and because of that, the only gameplay we're experiencing is one of pure navigation. Avoidance doesn't even particularly come into the picture. The atrium's so broad that circumnavigating where Roxy hangs around was not an issue at all. We've briefly discussed it a few times now, but I just want to reinstate as we come towards the back end of Security Breach what one of the biggest complaints is in relation to this game. On the whole, most of my takeaways have been quite positive. I love the look of the game, the atmosphere, and while the gameplay scenarios are oftentimes rather basic and lacking the same fear factor, I've still found the vast majority of the experience enjoyable. The biggest issue with Security Breach is that even if someone feels the exact same way about these aspects, they could very easily have their immersion and overall experience ruined when it comes to the technical side of the game. We've already discussed issues like having animatronics clipping into walls, or having their pathing broken with the most basic of maneuvers on our part. Even parts of the game that I assume are working as intended, like the animatronics teleporting all over the place when getting caught by a staff bot. They're so odd that many people have simply assumed these are glitches too. Making games is very difficult, yes, and I always like to give some leeway in regards to these things when it comes to devs that haven't particularly specialized in these grander experiences. But there is a point where something becomes inexcusable, and for me, that always directly relates to what the price of the game is. For the majority of the game's life currently, the price has been set to $40, about 20 to 30 below what big budget games charge nowadays. $40 is still a lot of money, however, and I do think that I would be overly generous to give this game a pass, considering how many technical issues will present themselves to the player. This is the first game I've played in a while where bugs were consistently showing up every time I played the game. game, and every time I returned to a section on subsequent attempts. The last time I experienced something to that same degree was likely Cyberpunk when it initially came out, and understand, what I'm referring to right now is after the several patches which the game received since it came out. I can only imagine from the response I've seen from fans that when Security Breach came out, it was even worse. So that's already a pain. You've got a game that's no longer getting patched, which still has the most ridiculous of bugs, like having the player randomly fall out the map, which I experienced at least a couple times while playing. What I found even more frustrating, however, is less to do with the developers really, and more the game engine they chose to work on for this game. Security Breach uses Unreal Engine 4, and for the longest time, I've been so frustrated with how this engine functions. I think Security Breach works as a brilliant example of how fantastic Unreal can be from a visual point of view. I adore how this game looks. It's a game that bucks the trend of so many games being released nowadays, which are testing out new processes and relying so much on AI for stability. The massive downside, however, is that when it comes to Unreal Engine 4, as well as the new Unreal Engine 5, I hardly see any game utilize this game engine without running into a consistent and ridiculous amount of stuttering. A more recent example would be the recent Silent Hill 2 remake. Having played the game myself, there was much to praise, but the degree to which the game was stuttering, seemingly getting worse the deeper I got into the game, it undeniably tainted the entire experience for me. Security Breach wasn't as bad, I don't think, but it's still definitely noticeable. If you can personally get used to it over time, much like I essentially did, then that's great, but I still find it inexcusable. I tried it on an SSD and hard drive and yielded the exact same results. The stuttering happens quite frequently as you wander around normally, but the most severe ones you'll experience is in the periods when new environments are getting loaded in, places like the elevators or winding backstage areas. I understand the purpose of them, wanting to keep the player in control of the character and not cut to a loading screen. But what's even the point when the game can oftentimes stutter so badly that we end up seeing a loading icon in the bottom right anyways? While I admire the game's positives too much for it to ruin the experience for me, I can completely understand why much of the talk revolved around the game, and many of the problems that have been brought up around it directly relate to these issues. Performance is shoddy, the game's still filled with a bunch of bugs, most of which are ones that players will more than likely experience on simply one playthrough. Not to mention, there's certain things in the options menu which simply don't work properly. I've got an RTX 4070 Super, and for pretty much any game I've used it on, it's been great, no matter what settings I'm configuring. With the exception of the stutters, Security Breach runs equally perfect as everything else. However, you switch something like the RTX on, and the game just falls apart. The frame rate makes the game unplayable. And talking of Cyberpunk once again, for all the performance issues that game once had, I can now use ray tracing in that game perfectly fine. So again, that's inexcusable to me. There's a setting in this game that I would have liked to use, but literally can't because of how broken it is. While I could grin and bear these things and still enjoy my time with the game, I wouldn't argue with anyone who thought these were deal breakers. If the option for ray tracing is there, why can't I use it without having a ridiculous frame rate consequence? And that's the ultimate point. While I could grin and bear these things and still enjoy my time with the game, if I'm spending $40 on a game, why should I be expecting bugs when the game's been out for years already? Making our way to Phaser Blast, we're made to take part in yet another small diversion, one in which we're given a Phaser Blaster and are then placed into an arena, where we have to capture 3 flags around the area while avoiding Chica and firing back at the staff bots that try to stop us. It's exactly what I described it as, a fun little diversion. It's definitely a lot more enjoyable compared to the Mazer-sized diversion, but simultaneously, I would still say our encounter with DJ Music Man was a bit more impactful. I like the concept of essentially taking part in a laser tag activity, but it's all very surface level, there's no real depth. With the Music Man section, it felt like many core elements of the game were getting utilised all at once. We attempted to avoid the animatronics while having to actively move closer towards them because of our navigation towards each of the switches, pairing that up with the loud music that played and the cramped environment we're placed in, and our senses were also hampered more than usual. We couldn't hear many of their movements or quotes they let out, and didn't have a great chance of escaping if spotted. All those elements potentially worked in reinforcing other mechanics in the game, whereas I usually found the cameras and noisemakers fairly ineffective. I could very much see the practicality of them in that scenario. I'd say the Phaser Blaster section is unique, and that's about it. Even though several staff bots come to attack when capturing each flag, I didn't find they present any great deal of threat, and weren't particularly overwhelming when it came to actually destroying the flags. Not to mention as well, despite still remaining fun in my opinion, I also thought the Phaser Blaster oftentimes found itself restricting what the scenario was trying to achieve, primarily because it works exactly the same as when we're eventually given it after we're done. Much like the Phas camera, the Phaser Blaster is another incredibly useful piece of equipment that we're able to use freely throughout the Pizzaplex. We can use it against the staff bots and the animatronics to stun them. them, making many of the areas that may have presented somewhat of a threat previously incredibly easy to navigate. Once you've acquired the Phaser Blaster, you are made to feel like you've now got a genuine superiority over the animatronics. The dynamic switches and the control is very much in your hands. Compared to running away and hiding like we've had to do throughout most of the game, we can now pull out our Phas camera or blaster and stun essentially everything and go about your business far more casually. The only exception to all this would be characters like Monty, who in his initial state remains immune to any of the stun effects. But even in his case, once he becomes the legless wreck that we've seen already, you can blast him away as much as you want. So the Phaser Blaster section fits in line with most sections in the game we've experienced already. A neat concept with a fantastic looking environment and great atmosphere with gameplay depth akin to a puddle. Once we're done capturing the flags, we're not only able to acquire the Phaser Blaster for ourselves, but upon making our way up another vent shaft found in the same room, we end up discovering a room that appears to serve as Vanny's hideout.
Freddy, that rabbit lady's in a secret room above Phaser Blast. It looks like a hideout. I think her name is Vanny?
This discovery is vital towards achieving a couple different endings for the game, with there being even more past these two, as we're about to see. With Phaser Blaster in hand, however, before leaving the area, we're made to acquire yet another security badge, as well as a bowling ticket that we can use to enter the Bonnie Bowl attraction. There's nothing that really stands out with the Bonnie Bowl location. The area is mostly filled with staff bots, with there not even being any animatronics wandering around unless you end up getting caught by them. All we need to do is find some Monty mystery mix, which we'll then be able to use to lure Chica into the trash compactor down by the kitchen area. The only real thing of note would be the endos that present themselves upon trying to leave, but even then, unless Freddy's entirely run out of charge, you can simply enter inside him and make your way out fairly easily. Upon making our way down to the kitchen, we can place the mix inside the compactor, and then activate a button nearby to crush Chica. Much like all the others, however, even despite how we rip out her voice box and turn her into an absolute wreck, the sewer section we find ourselves in shows Chica coming back to life. Unlike the other animatronics, however, from what I understand, Chica doesn't actually behave all that different to how she did before, unlike Roxy and Monty, who now show blatant differences, like how Roxy can no longer see and Monty doesn't have legs. Chica realistically spots you and runs after you like normal. We could stun her prior to this state and can still stun her now, so it's mainly her appearance that works as the biggest switch up. It would have been nice to perhaps see a bit more variation like the other animatronics present, but equally, due to the state Chica now finds herself in, and the screeching sounds that now burst out of her because of how she's got no voice box, Chica is still unique to me in that she remains one of the only animatronics in the game I perceive as being genuinely quite unsettling, and that's only amplified even more as we try to make our way out the sewers, having to make our way through several sections while switching on generators, with many of these areas being incredibly tight, leaving more room for us to get caught out and less room for us to escape. The only issue is the Phaser Blaster really, although I'm on the fence as to if it's even really a bad thing. Much like I said a moment ago, animatronics like Chica are essentially no longer a threat, despite liking the setup we're given and the small dark tunnel areas we journey through. The potential for any actual tension or scares goes away when you can pull out a gun, blast Chica in the face and run away. While I think giving the player a feeling of power at this stage of the game is appropriate, and is something I've seen replicated in many other horror experiences prior to Security Breach, it does also mean that other elements are naturally neglected at this point as well, especially in a section like this, one that's far more enclosed, one that's considerably darker, but more ominous than almost every other section we've been to up till now. There's genuine potential for some real frights to be given to the player. I know certain people would try and make the argument, well, just don't use the blaster then, but this is an argument I've pointed out time and time again to just not make any sense. As you would have heard throughout the video already, while interjecting my own opinions quite frequently, I'm ultimately not looking at these games from purely a personal point of view. Even though you or I may like or dislike a gameplay scenario, I'm observing all of these facets from the angle of what works well from a functional and mechanical standpoint. So in scenarios like this, where I personally feel items like the Phaser Blaster takes away from a section that could have otherwise been a bit more scary, the choice to not use it is one that's entirely personal. Someone else might choose to not use it and have even more fun during this section, but it's undeniable that if you've reached this area, you'll always have the Phaser Blaster on you. You've been given a tool to utilize whenever you want, a choice choice that's been made by the developers. And much like all the other choices we've seen them make throughout the game, whether it be the graphics, atmosphere, sound design, and so on, these have to be judged as they are, not with any self-imposed restrictions. And with that being said, while I don't particularly have any real issue with the sewer section, I can't help but feel it would have been even further enhanced if there was an actual restriction imposed to stop the player utilizing the blaster or camera. One final thing I'll say about this sewer section links into a greater point across the entire game, and that's the presence of Vanny. For a figure that whenever she's brought up seems to be the main antagonist, she seems to be so absent for such a large amount of the game's runtime. On my first playthrough, the only time I really remember seeing her was during a linear sequence that occurs after we're first caught by Vanessa. However, on subsequent playthroughs, I actually had a few more encounters in other parts of the game, one of which being in the sewers and another being in the atrium area. These not only felt incredibly random, but also so broken as well. Look at my encounter in the sewer, for example. When spotting Vanny, she not only appears to be skipping on the spot while not moving forward at all, but when spotting me, she then resorts to a T-pose for a second before then chasing after me. For as broken as this encounter was, it's still stuck in my mind because of how unexpected it felt. I hadn't experienced anything even close to this in my first few attempts at the game, so to all of a sudden have Vanny show up in a place that I'd never seen before was pretty creepy. From what I've gathered from looking into Vanny's appearances a bit deeper, however, it seems that she was initially going to play a much larger role. Situations like this are apparently scripted. She's always supposed to show up in this section of the sewers, and most people simply end up missing her because of how far she spawns behind you and how slow she moves forward. That is already pretty underwhelming. It may have enhanced my subsequent playthroughs because of how I hadn't seen her in this area before, but not everyone's going to be playing this game several times, and even if they do, they might still miss her. I've also heard that Vanny was initially going to be the only animatronic that would be able to freely roam the Pizzaplex, her functionality seeming to be similar to that of Mr. X from the Resi 2 remake, a figure who can follow you whenever and present herself wherever. As was confirmed by one of the devs, however, this was a feature that was never fully implemented and instead was cut from the game. Disappointing, but I'm glad I discovered we can actually see Vanny a few more times than I initially thought. The only issue, of course, is the way in which these encounters are presented. Even if the player doesn't miss them, which 9 times out of 10 I imagine will be the case, they're always made somewhat underwhelming because of how broken they appear. There wasn't one instance where Vanny spotted me and acted normally. She always resorted to a T-pose. And no, I don't think that was intentional. With all the animatronics dealt with, I think it's time we looked at the many ways the game can wrap up. The first, and most standard, actually occurs after we deal with Roxy. The way we got to Phazerblast and Monty Golf was by using 2 party passes, but the only way to get the second one of these is by activating this first potential ending, installing Roxy's eyes into Freddy, and having to make your way to the entrance that's now opened up. From here, you've either got 2 or 3 options, the first 2 being to stay or leave, where staying has Freddy giving you the party pass, and leaving results in a final cutscene that shows Gregory sleeping in a cardboard box, and getting pursued by Vanny. And talking of Vanny, so long as you found her hideout in Phazerblast, you can also decide to activate the Vanny ending at this point, which contains 2 separate endings of its own. Deciding to stay, I'd say it was this part of the game that was the key reason as to why I felt generally quite positive about Security Breach. And when you've got a game that's not only fairly simplistic for the vast majority of it, but also features sections like Mazer Size that I find beyond tedious, you're kind of needing the gameplay that is there to be fairly refined. What this final part of the game presents the player with, however, is absolute freedom. You're now at a point where there's no restrictions. Once you go and deal with that final animatronic, fully upgrade Freddy and get all of your equipment, it then becomes a case of wandering around the Pizzaplex, acquiring many of the upgrades and collectibles, as well as completing all the different endings. I'd already taken in and appreciated many of the environments up to this point, but it was at this stage where they really started sinking in and becoming genuinely memorable, and I'd assume that comes from one big factor, and that's simply reinforcement. On the first go round, I was impressed with much of what I was seeing, but upon returning 2, 3 or 4 more times, it only made me appreciate these areas even further, and these 2 elements tie directly together. Most of the endings are fairly easy to pin down, especially if you're following a guide online, but there's 2 here which revolve around journeying to several areas of the Pizzaplex, and those are the fire escape ending and Vanny's good ending. The first requires the player to acquire about 40 collectibles that can be found throughout the game, with around 5 of these having to be the golden plushies we're able to find. The second of these endings isn't too different. However, instead of collectibles, we're made to find 3 Princess Quest arcade machines in different areas of the Pizzaplex, in which playing and completing them all will unlock Vanny's good ending. And in saying that, it should become obvious where the reinforcement comes into play. We're not only returning to many of these areas multiple times, making them stick in our minds even more, but on top top of that, we're looking for things that require an even higher level of observation. So while you're exploring and searching for the arcade machines and collectibles, you are just naturally taken in these environments to an even greater extent, searching behind hidden passageways and crevices that you may have initially missed, giving you an even greater amount of appreciation towards how these areas are constructed. That's why this link works so well, even when looking to the gameplay side of things. While our goal may sound fairly simplistic, tracking down collectibles while having equipment like the Phaser Blaster that turn most threats into a joke now, because I found the environments to be so enjoyable to observe and explore, that became the highlight. I understood I was now experiencing what you'd call endgame content. I wasn't expecting any more cutscenes or meaningful interactions, and as a result, what I found was an experience I found rather relaxing, admittedly, especially when it comes to Freddy's eye upgrade. We're now given the chance to see most of these collectibles through walls, so there was never any issue of getting annoyed and having to search up the locations online, and as a result, it was almost like I was going on one last grand tour of the Pizzaplex, one that didn't disappoint, due to how well crafted I still found all these areas to be upon returning to them. And within all that, I feel like it should be said that many of the areas we return to will also present something new for many players. With the many security badges we've now acquired from progressing in the main story, there's certain locked off parts of previous areas that can now be accessed. Take the Fazbear Theatre and the Daycare Centre. This can only be accessed after getting a level 5 security badge, and when getting inside, we not only get another location that looks great and has been constructed nicely, but we also get even more collectibles, secret passageways, and even some hilarious occurrences, like the staffbot comedian or magician we can witness on stage.
How is everyone doing tonight? Great.
So the endgame side of things was excellent for me. It turned a game that I thought was pretty fun, with some great world design, into one that I found myself actively wanting to return to, even when there's very little motive towards what I was actually doing. Now, onto those endings. The vast majority of these are conveyed in the style of a comic book. For whatever reason, I'm not really sure. Some of these are pretty simplistic, and others require a bit more heavy lifting on our part. As I said with the entrance ending, deciding to leave out the main entrance shows Gregory running away from the Pizzaplex, and with seemingly no home to return to, or at least with no idea on where it's located, he climbs inside a cardboard box and sleeps down a back alley. We can see from the newspaper that he's placed over himself that many local residents have started disappearing, and with the appearance of Vanny at the end, the cause of these disappearances become pretty obvious. It seems that Vanny is continuing the legacy of William Afton, and going after many of the kids that visit the Fazbear establishment. There's two more of these escape endings, with there being one for leaving out a fire exit, and another for leaving out the loading docks area. Both of these are ridiculous, and obviously aren't supposed to be taken seriously whatsoever. The one at the loading dock shows Freddy and Gregory driving away from the Pizzaplex, where just like Freddy said when attempting to leave for the first time, his battery eventually dies. However, with Gregory linking him up to the car's battery, it seems like he's fully recharged, and will remain Gregory's friend for a lifetime. As for the fire exit, Freddy ends up burning the Pizzaplex down, whereupon having a showdown with Vanny, both fall off the roof, getting the reveal at the end that Vanny has actually been Vanessa all this time, if that wasn't already obvious. Following on from these, things do start getting a bit more substantial when it comes to the final three. Starting with the Vanny endings, we get one of the only other fully animated cutscenes in the game, the other being reserved for the final ending we'll discuss in a second. A bit of a shame, to be honest, because just like every other cutscene we see, I think it looks visually excellent, making me wish there were even more of these to see throughout the game. Although, much like everything that's given out sparingly, it does also make these moments stand out even more. As for what we do in this ending, it's rather lackluster, admittedly. Unlike the others, we aren't taken directly to the ending itself, although I don't particularly know why. All we have to do is run through a short gauntlet featuring the previous animatronics and some staff bots, and upon doing that and reaching Vanny's room, we need to either press the button on her desk to activate the bad ending, or interact with the arcade machine and play the final version of Princess Quest to get the good. It should be said at this point that while the Princess Quest game itself presents nothing that truly impressed me, it did bring a nice amount of variety, something that I felt also applied to the other mini games we can find, like Monty's Golf Course or the Balloon Boy arcade machine. Aside from the pixely art style that I think looks great, making a nice change from the low-res 8-bit visuals we usually see, the gameplay's like your typical Zelda experience, finding items to open doors, small puzzle sequences, enemies you can swipe out with your sword. As I say, nothing too amazing, but it makes our time reaching the inevitable ending feel a lot more worthwhile. The bad Vanny ending simply shows the staff bots turning on Vanny, however in the process, Freddy ends up dying. The good ending, however, has has all the staff bots shutting offline, and as Gregory plans to leave, with him taking along Freddy's head, Vanessa can be seen standing at the entrance, and upon reaching the end of the credits, we get a screen of them all watching a sunset while eating ice cream. This is said to be the true ending of the game, as it ties directly into what we saw in Help Wanted 1. It appears that by playing these Princess Quest games, we've severed the ties that Afton had over Vanny. As we see in the final moments of the game, we end up unlocking the large door that we also saw in one of the endings during Help Wanted, setting Vanessa free. Now, while that ending's speculated to be the true canon ending, I have a hard time writing off some of the other ones, and particularly the final one, as entirely irrelevant. I kind of look at it like the information we garner from the books that apply to the mainline games. While much of what we see may not have a great deal of relevance, there's things we can pick out that still remain true. In the fire exit ending, for example, we get the most blatant reveal of Vanessa being Vanny. Even with the Princess Quest one, we only see Vanny's mask on the floor and Vanessa standing at the entrance. It's implied that Vanessa's Vanny in that case, but not shown to the same extent. That's kind of how I feel about the final ending, with this being able to be found at the bottom of Roxy Raceway. Through much of the wreckage we find down here, we find a working elevator, and upon heading down, we stumble upon some pretty wild discoveries. Just like in the areas above, the place appears to be a wreck. However, when journeying forward, we eventually find things like a giant Freddy head that sits amongst the rubble. And eventually, when moving past some of the endos, we see that for some reason, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place is located all the way down here. Pay attention to the name of the restaurant to begin with. I initially assumed this was attempting to emulate one of the pizzerias from the first couple games. However, if we take a look back to the completion ending cutscene from Pizzeria Simulator, we're able to see the name of our restaurant was also Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place. Looking at the interior again, especially when observing how the two stages are set up, we can now very much see the resemblance between Michael Afton's restaurant and this one. But there's a key question up in the air, and that's, how did it even get here in the first place? Well, this can actually be discovered in one of the messages we're able to find throughout the game, namely the one labelled Sinkhole. In this message, we see someone giving an update on the construction of the Mega Pizzaplex, venting his frustrations about the problems they've been having along the way. They particularly point out how it feels like they're building on top of some kind of sinkhole, and judging by where this restaurant's located, we can see the builder was very much correct. After the fire, the pizza place presumably sunk into the ground, along with Michael Afton, Henry Emily, and the many other animatronics. The only contradiction would be the appearance of the restaurant. Considering the place burned down, it doesn't make much sense why so many things like the tables, hats, and stage curtains are retained, but I presume that was done to make the connection between this and Pizzeria Simulator a bit more clear. Talking of those animatronics though, we eventually end up discovering them when entering another large sinkhole in the restaurant itself. We can only descend to these levels while inside Freddy. Going alone will result in a jump scare. Not a jump scare of Baby, or Molten Freddy, or any animatronic we've seen before admittedly, but instead a brand new amalgamation referred to as Tangle. While it's not 100% confirmed how Tangle came to be, we can see from its design that we've got a similar situation to Molten Freddy, but cranked up to an even more extreme degree. Tangle isn't one sole animatronic. It's a huge mass of wires that contain several other animatronics within it. Notable ones would be the likes of Funtime Freddy, whose mask sits on Tangle's head. There's also Chica, who we can see poking out the abomination, with wires shooting out her mouth. We can see the heads of Bonnie, Mangle, Baby, and the puppet, with there also being many arms and legs sticking out that could relate to all kinds of animatronics. As I say, we don't particularly know how this happened and how all these animatronics ended up in this mess. While the fire may have played a role in perhaps merging all these guys together, it doesn't explain how certain animatronics are here. The main head of Funtime Freddy should realistically appear more like Molten Freddy considering what we saw in Fnaf 6. And how did characters like Bonnie and Chica end up here? They weren't able to be seen or purchased, with the same obviously going for Mangle and the puppet. Tangle was one of those things that remains up in the air right now. Although, with a design this grey and a mystery this intriguing, I have to imagine it'll get elaborated on during the upcoming Secret of the Mimic. From here, we end up falling into a familiar office environment, with 3 monitors that show security cameras set up around the area, 2 doors beside us and a vent in front. However, it's what we see immediately after this that serves as one of the biggest reveals in the entire game, and that's how William Afton is still somehow alive. seeming to be preserved in one of the charging stations. Afton awakes after we arrive, with the design of his model appearing far more detailed and simply far more like Springtrap compared to what we saw in Fnaf 6. The final gameplay scenario all revolves around stopping Afton from messing around with Freddy, as we see him do during the initial cutscene. And while doing this, Roxy, Monty, and Chica have also somehow made their way down here, in which we need to stop them entering our room as we burn Springtrap with the buttons in front of the monitors. I love the setup, and much like we've been seeing throughout the entirety of this ending, I adore all the callbacks and references we've seen along the way. There is one huge issue I have with this final sequence, however, and that's how I perceive it as being outright busted. So much so that it essentially ruins all the great work that comes before it. First off, the performance in this section was never stable. From the moment we jump out of Freddy and start looking at the monitors, you can very clearly see the game stuttering, which already makes the experience pretty horrible. As for what we do here, it's simply a matter of closing the doors and vents when the animatronics make their way towards us, and also burning Springtrap when he's messing with Freddy. Chica and Monty are relatively fine, with Freddy warning us of when they're making their way to the room, in which we need to close the doors and they'll eventually walk away. Roxy, however, was just outright broken for me though, and I'm still not 100% sure what was going on. Unlike the other two, the doors won't stop her from entering the room, and with Freddy telling us to simply hide, the only outright hiding spot here is inside Freddy's stomach. In theory, we should be able to jump in Freddy, wait for Roxy to approach, and send her away by using Chica's voice box. Only issue is that if Springtrap starts messing around with Freddy at any time while you're inside, you'll be kicked out and Freddy will enter one of the nearby charging stations for a while. This means that you're basically unable to hide from Roxy. I've heard some people claim they were able to avoid her by hiding behind certain items in the room, but when I tried that in my case, it never seemed to work effectively. This results in a ridiculous period where you'll be chased around the room by Roxy while waiting for Freddy to charge up. Bearing in mind we're getting chased, I wasn't paying all that much attention to the monitors, and as a result, didn't make the connection that Freddy was booting me out because of Springtrap. And as you can see yourself, this led to a ridiculous patch of gameplay where I was trying to get into Freddy, kept getting kicked out, and had to run around the room for ages while Roxy chased me. Aside from the glitches that do still very much apply to this section, what I'm describing is intentional, and that's even worse to me. You can clearly see that we're being given more of a chance to escape as Roxy pursues us, as in any other instance we'd be dead pretty much straight away. So Roxy's by far the worst part in all this for me, but even when removing her from the equation, there's nothing about this sequence that's impressive at all. You're pressing buttons until you win. With Chica and Monty, you're given so much time to close the doors that they're hardly even a threat. The visuals look fine, but are ruined by the performance issues, and the only thing outside Roxy I found even remotely threatening were Tangle's wires that eventually flood in. But even then, I felt that was cheap. I feel like it was more about me being unsure of where I was safe, compared to being truly concerning. So yeah, I'm not that thrilled about the gameplay, but at least the ending cutscene looks great. In this, we see the area start to explode and burst with flames, and as Afton tries to escape, Tangle grabs him and assumedly kills him in the process, linking back to the souls of the dead kids that, despite apparently being set free twice now, are still floating around inside this mechanical beast. And with that, you and Freddy make your way out of there, with a final image being shown at the end of the credits once again, this time with only you and Freddy watching the sunset. So that's Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, but before we wrap up, it's important we give a mention to the free DLC that was released referred to as Ruin. Taking price into account once again, I find Ruin to be an absurdly generous piece of DLC to offer, as from what we see during our time playing, it's clear there's been a great deal of effort put in. You can see this right from the start, with how the entrance to the Pizzaplex has been entirely redesigned. Ruin takes place either several months, or potentially a whole year after the events of Security Breach. It appears the Pizzaplex has now been shut down and subsequently abandoned, with the several gaping holes we're able to see on the floor, and the hundreds of newspapers that are stuck onto the entrance giving us a clue as to why. Not only was this place bound to fall apart due to where it's been built, but it also appears those missing people have now been tied back to the notorious Fazbear eating establishment. There's many things I appreciate about Ruin, but there's also many things I feel take away from elements I enjoyed in the main part of the game. From what I've seen, it appears like a large majority of fans actually prefer what Ruin has to offer compared to the main game, as you can already see from the dark, dingy environments. We're stepping back into a more horror-focused direction. This equally applies to all the animatronics we meet along the way, with all their designs now appearing even more grotesque and broken. However, in my opinion, and this will be controversial for some, I'm not a huge fan of this direction. The reason I threw so much praise towards the environments and atmosphere in the main game was because of how unique I found it to be. Was it scary? No, not really, but it's very clear that a large part of the game wasn't really trying to be. In Ruin, we're exploring areas that look far more similar to many other games I've played before. Everything's dark, broken, covered with dirt and muck, in creating a more frightening atmosphere, which I admit is achieved. It misses out on one of Security Breach's strongest traits, at least for me. The story's equally as simple as the main game, having us take control of a girl called Cassie, who's apparently been summoned to the Pizzaplex by Gregory. From a radio message we're given, we're told he's been captured and that we'll have to go find him. And this is where the second big drawback comes into play for me, and that's how the gameplay's been structured. Yet another facet of the main game which I found to be quite unique was the manner in which we could eliminate the animatronics and the freedom we're given to explore the entire Pizzaplex whenever we please. That's entirely gone with Ruin. This DLC takes on a far more linear approach, having us move from section to section as we make our way towards Gregory. Luckily, compared to a game like Sister Location that took linear game design to an absolute extreme, Ruin still remains consistently entertaining despite this new structure, and it's something that once again I'm pretty sure most fans actually approve of. That's fine of course, but in my view, I think it makes the experience a tad more binary than I would have liked. The biggest switch up in terms of gameplay has to come from the mask we're given at the beginning, which is utilised from start to finish. I think the mask system works great, bringing a nice deal of creativity in how we navigate the environments, presenting some nice challenges along the way, which end up using mechanics like the camera system to much better effect compared to the main game, and overall just adding an extra puzzle element that was basically missing up till now. Well, with the exception of Mazer size of course, but this is considerably better compared to that. While using this mask, we're continually pursued by a threat referred to as the Entity. This rabbit-like figure presents itself mainly when we wear the mask for a prolonged amount of time, giving the system even more depth. We're not only having to observe our environment to locate things which will help us progress, we're also having to deal with this guy when interacting with them as well. In relation to this interaction, as I say, much of it's now puzzle-based. We're made to observe cameras and match icons to open a path forward, match up several different icons in a grid. Nothing I look at as being innovative or amazing particularly, but much like other elements I've discussed, they're fairly conventional of many other horror games I've played in the past. That equally applies to elements outside the mask as well. When we're not avoiding the animatronics like normal, or keeping an eye on the endos, we're now made to open routes forward by doing things like using a Faz wrench to charge many conduits throughout the game, simply being a case of having multiple electrical lines charge up to the same level. Outside of that, however, there's not many more things I feel I can add to Ruin, primarily because of the general direction it takes in so many facets. The formula feels considerably more rigid, which I suppose works in making the experience a bit more consistent, both in a visual, atmospheric, and gameplay sense, but it sacrifices many of the more unique moments I was hoping for. There's no new areas here exactly. Almost everything we see is a redesign of areas we visit in the main game. However, because quite literally everything now is so run down, it leaves each area feeling less distinct in my opinion. For example, whereas in the main game, Roxy Raceway was considerably different to Monty Golf, I now find there's not a great deal separating them. Their designs don't stand out in the same way. If you think that's a reasonable sacrifice to make to generate the scarier atmosphere, that's perfectly fine. But in my view, it didn't feel like it was matching up with what I'd previously experienced. Despite being part of Security Breach, Ruin very much feels like a different kind of game, striving for different goals. Is the DLC more tightly designed? I'd say yes. While I think there were greater levels of variety in the main game, I find the puzzle elements that return several times throughout actively build on each other, becoming more fulfilling the deeper you get into Ruin. It now means that gameplay isn't essentially all based around avoiding animatronics or flipping switches. There's a good deal of depth, and more consistently too. And I should reinstate, I did have a good time with Ruin. For the issues I have with it, I still had fun running into the animatronics and discovering what's happened to all the areas I've become familiar with. It's purely the conventionality that's my biggest problem, I think. Despite the main game's flaws, I appreciated what it was trying to do. Ruin feels like it's playing things a bit safer, and judging by the response from fans, it seemed like it worked. There is some multiple endings to be found in Ruin, however, there's only 3 this time. In both main endings, we head back to the pizza place via a different route, discovering the likes of Candy Cadet in the process.
I am the Candy Cadet. Come get your candy here. I have candy all day, every day. Candy.
However, upon making our way back to the office area, we first deactivate a large machine referred to as Mexus, seeming to be the root cause of the digital rabbit that's kept following us. And after using a nearby forklift to bust out of the place, it's revealed that all this time we haven't been talking to Gregory, but instead have been talking to a brand new animatronic referred to as the Mimic.
You saved me! You saved me. Gregory? I'm Gregory.
They've been imitating Gregory's voice, and only after we're saved by Roxy, who previously seemed to show some affinity with Cassie earlier in the game, we're contacted by the real Gregory, saying that he's been trying to reach us all night.
I've been trying to reach you all night. I'm not at the Pizzaplex. Something's trying to trick you.
We're then chased by the Mimic throughout this cave system, where Gregory guides us towards the exit. However, upon seemingly escaping and reaching an elevator, we get one final twist.
It's not your fault. I know you did it for me. To save me. But we can't risk being followed. I'm sorry.
Gregory?
No!
A damn twisted ending, but I love it. During this first one, it's also possible for us to experience another ending that appears to be a bit more minor, where during the chase, if we differ from Gregory's instructions at a particular point, we run into an old cutout of what seems to be Freddy Fazbear. Putting on the mask at this point takes us to a final screen, where Gregory, Vanessa, and Helpy are shown eating ice cream. I have no real idea on what this one even means, perhaps an allusion to how this ending in the main game is the true one, as I speculated earlier. Outside that, it's just weird. The final ending, however, not only has us go on a different path compared to entering the elevator, but when it comes to the Mimic, this time they appear to be dressed up in some kind of mascot suit. Using mods, some players manage to glitch their way into the room just before the cave entrance, where usually the cutscene would play before taking you right into the set piece. Inside this room are two other mascot costumes, one of an elephant and another one of a bird, and while the costume they're wearing currently is torn to shreds, it seems to resemble some kind of lion. These details are mostly important when looking to the upcoming release, as not only do we know Secret of the Mimic will likely revolve mainly around this character, but in the recent trailers we also see the return of the very same elephant costume we see here. From there, it's simply a matter of running away once again, but as opposed to entering the elevator this time, we instead run into an open doorway in the same corridor, eventually taking us to a room with a button to activate, resulting in the Mimic seemingly being taken out by some kind of scooper. The significance of the Mimic and what this all means will assumedly get answered in the upcoming game, but as of right now, it seems that all we've got to go off is how there's now a brand new animatronic who dresses up in varying costumes while having the ability to imitate the voice of others. And in saying that, I can already see how some nice gameplay opportunities could open up from a concept like that. With all that being said, that takes us to the end of our time with Security Breach. I'll admit, with all the criticism I was seeing when going into it, I came away pleasantly surprised. While the game does have its fair share of issues, especially in the performance and bug department, there is definitely stuff I admire greatly about this game. As you would have heard, I found the visuals and atmosphere outstanding, while presenting a different kind of horror experience, one that's not going for dark environments and shocking scares. The feeling of being a small kid trapped inside a huge complex with killer animatronics, it did still create a nice sense of fear throughout. All the animatronics we meet are given a great deal of personality, not only from their appearance, but also their dialogue. Even one-off characters like Sun remain memorable by the time I was done. When it comes to the game's presentation, and by that I mean graphics, sound design, and all that kind of stuff, I think Security Breach does a great job. Where things start falling short is most definitely in the gameplay and technical department though. This game is very basic, there's no two ways about it. The fact that I perceived Ruin as having just as, if not even more depth compared to the main experience says it all really. If you're spotted by a threat, run away and hide. And not to mention, because the devs were clearly aware these threats weren't effective enough given the space you're working with, the majority of our time is actually spent dealing with a repetitive staff boss. A good idea in theory, but one that feels done to death by the time you're finished. In all that, you've got another issue that makes the animatronics less threatening, and that's how buggy and inconsistent they oftentimes are. There were simply too many times where one of them was staring right at me and didn't do anything, or one was chasing after me and immediately was confused after I ran past a certain object. Security Breach has all the hallmarks of a small team of devs working on something genuinely ambitious, and that's very much the case. This is where I'd like to remind people that Stillwell Studios at this time was only made up of around 20 people or so, and putting that into perspective, I think they do a brilliant job in creating something that does feel genuinely expansive, and does present something I found to be unique and genuinely worthwhile. Understand, I've never been looking at this game from a fan's perspective. I've tried to observe all these games on their individual merits. I get why a lot of the fan base don't like this game. The story isn't particularly intriguing, aside from some details towards the back end of the game. The game's nowhere near as scary. On a gameplay front, we're jumping a mile away from what made Cawthon's original games unique. We've gone from a genre that was literally created and defined by the first Fnaf game to one that's a lot more conventional when looking at the horror video game genre at large. I in no way find this game to be perfect. Its flaws are blatant, and will likely present themselves to you every time you come back to it. But in that sense, I think what Security Breach mostly reminds me of are games that you'd refer to as AA titles. Ones that clearly have a good concept and budget behind them, but perhaps not the experience or manpower to pull off the project as effectively as possible. I get why fans describe the game as disappointing compared to anything else, as from the outside looking in, there's tons of potential you can imagine from a conceptual point of view that doesn't particularly get capitalized on. The idea of a large complex you can freely roam around is great, but to not have the animatronics remain a constant threat, and instead having them locked down to certain areas, it could feel like a wasted opportunity for some. Talking from my point of view though, Security Breach is a game that I found to be consistently entertaining and engaging throughout. You could describe it as a game of moments, peaks and troughs, but again, I'd only describe it that way when it comes to the gameplay. While on repeat playthroughs, I was anticipating my return to the daycare section, Phaserblast and Monty's golf course. There's quite a few sections in between all that which feel considerably more lackluster. Sections where we're making our way past many staff bots, or god forbid, solving the Mazer-size room. But even within that, I have to state once again that because I find the visual design to be so strong, there's rarely any point where I'm ever checked out of the experience. So once again, surprised to be the keyword I take away from Security Breach. Despite knowing the fan reaction to this one, I went in with no expectations whatsoever, and as you would have heard, while there's still plenty you can point to that isn't that great, and shouldn't be in the game to begin with, there's so much more alongside that which I found was executed brilliantly. And with that, we reach the end of our time with the Five Nights at Freddy's series. And when looking back on everything we've talked about, what's the ultimate conclusion? I perceive this series to be one of the most innovative and impactful franchises the horror video game genre's ever seen. But it's not just that, it's also an amazing example of individual effort and resilience on the part of Scott Cawthon. As we discussed, prior to FNAF 1, Cawthon was having essentially no success with the games he was releasing. With all the titles we see him work on during this period, it's obvious that he was incredibly passionate about video game development, but like anything you decide to release for the general public to consume, you don't want to just be ignored. You want people to see what you've created, see what you've got to offer, receive thoughts on what people liked and disliked. For Cawthon to go such a long amount of time with near to no success, while still striving to create something brilliant, something people would enjoy and resonate with, I think many could learn from this mindset nowadays. In a period that seems to be so focused on instant gratification, content that's frivolous, meaningless, and will be forgotten once someone's flicked onto something else, Cawthon's an amazing example of pure determination to make something that's not working eventually work. Determination and resilience will only get you so far though. You could do exactly what Cawthon did and pump out tons of games, but still never get anywhere with them. But that's why quality and a little bit of luck is equally as important. It's the old quantity over quality argument. However, if you're an aspiring content creator, indie developer, or filmmaker, I think quality is always the answer. A catalogue of work is important, but you can't expect anyone to ever pay attention to begin with if there's nothing genuinely quality that draws them in. And that's exactly what FNAF was for Cawthon. In discovering FNAF all those years ago, I've now returned to the series, and experienced much of Cawthon's forgotten work that next to no one played at the time. And while none of these were perfect, there were still traits that I found to be admirable. I think it's one of the biggest success stories in the video game landscape nowadays. A sole creator who worked on his own for years, slowly building off the original concept he had with FNAF 1, to now having big budget games and feature films being developed. That's another factor we have to consider when observing these games though. While Cawthon could sometimes find himself complacent, most notoriously when it came to FNAF World's initial release, there was a general evolution when it came to each new entry. FNAF 1's concept was revolutionary in my opinion. It spawned a whole new subcategory in the horror genre, to where any game that's maybe inspired or replicating certain features will always be compared to FNAF first and foremost. The first game does a lot with a little. We don't have a movement system, so we'll flesh out the world with a camera system. And it's that kind of philosophy that's incredibly important when working on your own with near to no budget. Whereas money can oftentimes work as a quick fix to a problem, when you're working solo, you're gonna have to get creative. Quality is important, as we discussed, but you also don't want to get stuck in a hole and work on something for so long that nobody ever sees it. And from the first game onwards, whether it be small or big evolutions, I always felt like I was in for something unique with the FNAF series, something I couldn't quite experience with any anything else. Fnaf 2 was the clearest example of purely evolving the original concept, adding more animatronics and gameplay features to make the gameplay formula more engaging. Fnaf 3 took a step back in many ways, while still retaining and refining this formula. The second game suffered from being too overwhelming in my opinion, so much so that it took away from the atmosphere and jump scares that were highlights in the first game. 3 returns to that, while turning a formula that was so oftentimes based on being reactive into one that's entirely proactive. The fourth entry was the exact opposite, once again evolving primarily off the first entry, but this time flipping the script. Whereas in that game we had no movement but a camera system to flesh out the world, now we've got movement but no camera system. The best example of the pure horror that Cawthon can create with these games, with Fnaf 4 still remaining the scariest entry in the series for me, with some of the best atmospheres and art direction on top of that. You then had Sister Location with a more linear game design, Pizzeria Simulator with its hybrid-like gameplay, and even some RPG and VR entries when leading up to what at this point is still the biggest project in the series right now. And finishing with Security Breach, I do find it a bit of a shame the way much of the community responded to this one. It's something that I feel yet again can apply to many forms of media that are put out in the public space. For all the praise that can be heaped onto these projects, there will be criticism, and rightfully so. Especially in this case, there was plenty to criticize. But as we saw when looking at the game at large, there was also much to praise on top of that. It seems like many people see things in such a binary manner. It's either good or bad, with no in between. And in many cases, even if someone does see the positives in a piece of work, they may only feel the need to express what's bad compared to what's good. Game development is a business. What people spend their money on and what they think of these projects is important, and can definitely shape the direction of upcoming entries. And looking forward to Secret of the Mimic, I would hope that whatever Cawthon and Steelwall have cooked up for the fanbase is being done on their own terms. Many things I liked about Security Breach were not so popular with others, and vice versa. But if I was in the developer's shoes, no way should any outside noise impact the ultimate creative vision, whether it be positive or negative. Ever since its release, Fnaf's had its peaks and troughs in terms of general popularity, but it's still always been there. It's always been a constant. You've always had people making brand new analysis and theory videos regarding so many elements of these games, people creating fan games, artwork and so on. Fnaf has been an absolute breeding ground for creativity, and looking outside of the games, that's one of the main traits I admire. Fnaf struck a chord with people to an extent where they're still just as passionate about the series all these years later, and I'd hope that from this, other creators see what it takes to create something like Fnaf, and the journey someone like Cawthon had to go on before attaining the immense success, and apply that to what they're doing. I'm not going to sit here and say these are the best games ever created. Due to the circumstances in which most of them were developed, they almost can't be. But there is something undeniably special when it comes to this series that I'm not sure even the biggest of gaming franchises will achieve. And it's in that where I think you find the key. For as big as Fnaf now is, there's still a very personal feeling that connects myself and many others to the series. The humble beginnings of downloading De Jure to play the first game, all the way up to now where I'm paying for a ticket to go see the Fnaf movie at my local cinema. For many like myself, it feels like we've been on this journey alongside Cawthon. We've seen the series grow and grow over time, with it now being adopted by a different type of audience entirely, and with whatever the series may hold in the upcoming years. That special quality that I associate with this series is one that will stay with players for a lifetime.